The land that would become Greece has never been easily gathered into a single shape. Its mountains rise abruptly from narrow plains, dividing one valley from another. Its coastline breaks into countless bays and promontories, while islands scatter across the Aegean like stepping stones between Europe and Asia. In such a country, the sea was rarely a distant horizon. It was present in daily life, beyond a field of barley, below a hilltop village, at the edge of a harbour, where fishing boats rested on shingle beaches. Long before there was a Greek people in the later sense, the geography of the region had already begun to shape the character of those who lived there. The mountains offered stone, timber, pasture and protection, but they also made travel overland slow and uncertain. Communities separated by only a few miles might have been divided by ridges, ravines, or thick woodland. The sea, by contrast, connected them. A modest boat could cross from one island to another, carrying obsidian, pottery, wool, olive oil, and news. The same waters led eastward toward Anatolia and the great cultures of the Near East, southward toward Egypt, and westward toward the central Mediterranean. From the beginning, the history of Greece was never simply the history of an isolated peninsula. It was the history of a maritime world, open to influences from many shores and yet marked by its own difficult, fragmented terrain. Human beings had lived in these lands for many thousands of years. They hunted in caves, gathered wild plants, and gradually learned to cultivate the soil and keep animals. By the Neolithic age, settled farming communities had appeared in fertile places such as Thessaly, Macedonia, and the Peloponnese. Their houses were often built from mud brick and timber. Their lives followed the slow rhythms of sowing, harvest, birth, illness, and burial. They shaped clay into bowls and storage jars, polished stone tools, and maintained ties with neighboring settlements. Even then, the Aegean was a place of movement. Obsidian from the island of Melos has been found far from its source, evidence that people had already learned to navigate the waters with purpose and confidence. Over the centuries, communities became larger and more complex. During the early Bronze Age, beginning around the 3rd millennium BCE, metal began to alter the possibilities of everyday life. Copper and bronze tools were stronger than stone, though they required distant materials and skilled hands. Bronze itself was made by combining copper with tin, and tin was not readily available in the Aegean. Those who could secure such resources through trade gained wealth and influence. Small settlements began to develop into local centers. Houses grew larger, workshops appeared, and burial places revealed widening differences between rich and poor. The people of the Aegean did not yet think of themselves as Greeks in the way later generations would. They belonged to households, villages, islands, and local rulers. Their speech may have varied from place to place. Their religious practices were rooted in the landscape around them, in springs and caves, in peaks touched by cloud, in the changing force of the sea. The natural world was not an abstract setting for their lives. It was a presence that could nourish, threaten, and perhaps listen. On the island of Crete, south of the Greek mainland, a remarkable civilization gradually emerged. Crete lay at a strategic point in the eastern Mediterranean, close enough to the coasts of Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt to participate in their commercial and cultural networks, yet distant enough to develop a distinctive character of its own. Its mountains enclosed fertile plains, and its southern coast opened toward Africa and the Eastern Sea. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, several large centers had begun to dominate the island. Later generations would know this civilization as Minoan, a name derived from the legendary King Minos, though the people themselves did not leave behind a name by which they called their own society. At Knossos, near the northern coast, a vast complex rose over time around open courts, storerooms, shrines, workshops, and administrative rooms. Other great centers appeared at Phaistos in the south, Malea on the north coast, and Zakros in the east. These places are often called palaces, though they were more than royal residences. They were centers of authority and exchange. Farmers brought in grain, olives, wine, wool, and livestock. Craftsmen worked ivory, stone, metal, and clay. Officials counted goods and recorded them. Priests and worshippers gathered for ceremonies whose precise meaning now lies beyond recovery. The buildings themselves were carefully planned. Their rooms opened onto courtyards flooded with Cretan light. Staircases connected upper chambers to storerooms below. Water was carried through channels and pipes, while broad magazines held enormous clay jars, known as pithoi, filled with the products of the countryside. A visitor arriving from a small village might have been overwhelmed by the scale of such a place. The painted walls, the busy workshops, the smell of oil and grain, the movement of servants and officials, the distant sound of music or ritual gathering in the court. The art of Minoan Crete suggests a society deeply attentive to movement, color, and the natural world. Frescoes showed dolphins swimming through blue water, birds among flowering plants, youths and women in ceremonial dress, and figures engaged in the perilous sport or ritual of bull leaping. The images do not offer simple answers about Minoan belief, but they reveal an aesthetic unlike the heavy martial scenes favored by some later societies. In Cretan art, the sea seems alive with creatures, and the landscape itself appears full of sacred energy. Women occupy a striking place in many Minoan images, sometimes dressed in elaborate garments with flounced skirts and open bodices, sometimes taking part in processions and rituals. It would be unwise to imagine that these images alone reveal the true position of women in society, since art often expresses ideals rather than ordinary life. Yet they suggest that female figures held a visible and perhaps important role in ceremonial life. Small figurines of goddesses, worshippers, and animals have been found in sanctuaries across the island. Many were placed in caves or on mountain peaks, where people may have sought protection, fertility, rain, healing, or favor from powers associated with the earth and sky. The Minoans wrote in at least 2 scripts. The earlier, known as Cretan hieroglyphic, remains only partly understood. The later script, Linear A, has still not been deciphered. Its signs appear on clay tablets, vessels and seals, indicating a complex administrative system, but the language behind it remains unknown. This silence gives Minoan civilization a particular sense of distance. Its buildings, ornaments, frescoes, and records survive, but its own voice has not yet been fully recovered. We can see the marks of officials counting and organizing, but we cannot hear their conversations, their prayers, or the names they gave to their rulers. Trade helped sustain this world. Cretan ships traveled across the Aegean and beyond it, carrying finely made pottery, textiles, oil, wine, and crafted goods. In return came metals, ivory, precious stones, and objects from distant lands. Minoan-style vessels have been found in Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, while Egyptian influence appears in some Cretan art and design. The island was not an imperial power in the later sense, commanding a vast territory through armies and governors, but its influence spread through trade, prestige, and maritime connection. For ordinary people, life was more modest than the splendor of the palaces might suggest. Most people worked the land. They tended sheep and goats on the hillsides, cultivated cereals in the plains, pressed olives, harvested grapes, and fished along the coast. They lived in towns, hamlets, and farmsteads, bound by family, local obligation, and seasonal labor. The products they made or grew entered systems of exchange controlled in part by the palace centers. A household's prosperity could depend on the weather, on the fertility of its fields, and on whether distant trade routes remained open. Beneath the painted grandeur of Knossos lay the steady, repetitive work of countless hands. The Minoan world was not untouched by disaster. Earthquakes were a persistent fact of life in the Aegean, and many settlements show evidence of destruction and rebuilding. Sometime in the 17th century BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, erupted with extraordinary force. The explosion transformed the island's landscape and sent ash and waves across parts of the Aegean. Its exact effects on Crete remain uncertain, and the Minoan civilization did not simply vanish in a single moment. Yet the eruption belonged to a period of wider strain and change, reminding the islanders that the sea, which carried wealth and connection, could also bring devastation. By the middle of the 15th century BCE, the balance of power in the Aegean had begun to shift. On the Greek mainland, a different society was rising behind the walls of fortified hilltop centers. These were the Mycenaeans, named after the great citadel of Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. Their rulers adopted many aspects of Cretan administration, art, and religious practice, but they shaped them within a more openly martial political order. The roots of Mycenaean power lay in the mainland's fertile basins and strategic routes. By around 1600 BCE, wealthy warrior elites were being buried in deep shaft graves near Mycenae. Their tombs contained gold masks, decorated weapons, jewelry, cups, and objects made from amber and other materials brought from afar. These burials spoke of rulers who wanted their wealth and authority to be remembered. They also showed that the mainland was already tied into the wider networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. In time, these early elites established palace centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Orchomenos, and elsewhere. Each controlled a surrounding territory of villages, fields, workshops, and smaller settlements. The palaces stood on defensible heights or were protected by powerful walls. At Mycenae, the stone fortifications were so immense that later Greeks believed they could only have been built by the Cyclopes, the giant builders of myth. The name Cyclopean has remained attached to these vast walls of irregular limestone blocks, fitted together with an enduring force that still commands attention. Within the citadel at Mycenae, a visitor passed through the Lion Gate, where two great lions stood carved above the entrance. Beyond lay storerooms, houses, shrines, and the central hall, known as the Megaron. This hall, with its hearth at the center and throne against the wall, formed the heart of palace authority. Here the Wonax, the king, received officials, held ceremonies, and presided over a world structured by rank. The ruler was not merely a military leader. He stood at the summit of an administrative and religious system that gathered resources from the countryside and redistributed them through the palace. At Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, the remains of a palace preserve an especially vivid sense of this system. Its rooms included storerooms, workshops, baths, and a richly painted throne room. Clay tablets discovered there had been accidentally baked hard when the palace burned, preserving administrative records that would otherwise have dissolved back into the earth. Written in Linear B, a script adapted from the earlier Minoan Linear A, these tablets were deciphered in the 20th century and revealed something of profound importance. The language they recorded was Greek. The Linear B tablets are not literature. They contain no epic poems, personal letters, or philosophical reflections. They are practical documents concerned with sheep, grain, chariots, vessels, land, textiles, workers, and offerings to the gods. Yet their dry lists allow a distant society to emerge with unexpected clarity. They name officials, shepherds, bronze workers, textile laborers, and religious personnel. They record large numbers of women employed in spinning and weaving, often alongside children. They show that palace economies depended on detailed accounting and centralized control. A scribe pressing marks into wet clay could not have known that, thousands of years later, those small tablets would offer one of the earliest written glimpses of the Greek language. Mycenaean society was unequal and tightly organized. At the top stood the Onax, whose authority may have combined political, economic, military, and sacred functions. Beneath him were high-ranking officials, local leaders, and military figures. The term Lauagetas, perhaps meaning leader of the people, appears in the tablets, though its precise role remains uncertain. There were landholders, priests and priestesses, craftsmen, farmers, herders, and dependent laborers. Some people were enslaved, often women and children whose origins may have been linked to war or raiding. The palace did not necessarily control every act of daily exchange, but it commanded enough resources to shape the life of the region around it. War was deeply woven into the Mycenaean imagination. Weapons were placed in graves. Fortified citadels looked out over routes and plains. The tablets mention chariots, armor, and groups of men assigned to coastal watch. A famous suit of bronze armor found at Dendra, made of overlapping plates that enclose the body, gives an impression of the costly equipment available to elite warriors. Such armor would have been heavy and restrictive, suited perhaps to a chariot fighter or high-status combatant, rather than an ordinary foot soldier. For most men called to defend their community, warfare would have been more immediate and less splendid. A spear, a shield, a helmet, perhaps a sword, and the fear of an approaching enemy. The Mycenaeans travelled widely. Their pottery has been found from Italy to the Levant, and their merchants or envoys moved through a world dominated by powerful kingdoms. Egypt, the Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the city-states of Syria and the Levant, and the kingdoms of Cyprus all participated in a broad network of exchange. Ships carried oil, wine, ceramics, timber, metals, textiles, and luxury goods. Messages passed between courts. Marriages may have connected ruling families. A crisis in one part of this world could affect people far away. For a failed harvest, a pirate attack, or the closure of a trade route could interrupt supplies upon which palaces depended. The Mycenaean rulers also came to dominate Crete. By the 15th century BCE, Linear B appears at Knossos, suggesting that Greek-speaking administrators had taken control of the island's leading center. Minoan traditions did not disappear at once. Cretan craftsmanship, religious imagery, and administrative practices continued to influence the mainland. But the political center of the Aegean had moved. The palaces of the mainland now stood as the most powerful courts in the Greek-speaking world. Later, Greek tradition remembered a distant age of kings, great houses, and wars around the city of Troy. The poems attributed to Homer, composed centuries after the Mycenaean palaces had disappeared, preserved names such as Agamemnon, Nestor and Menelaus. Mycenae became associated with Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek expedition against Troy, Pylos with the old and wise Nestor. Archaeology cannot simply confirm the events of the epic poems, which were shaped by long centuries of oral storytelling. Yet the poems preserved a memory of an earlier world of powerful rulers, fortified centers, feasting halls, warriors, and dangerous voyages across the sea. For a Mycenaean king, the sea may have represented both opportunity and threat. It carried ships bearing metals and tribute, but it also brought raiders and rival powers. The palace at Pylos, in its final years, appears to have organized watches along the coast, perhaps in anticipation of attack. In the eastern Mediterranean as a whole, the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE were a time of growing instability. Great states that had endured for generations began to weaken or collapse. Cities were burned, trade routes fractured. Groups of migrants and raiders moved across the sea and land. Later Egyptian records referred to some of these wandering peoples as the Sea Peoples, though the full story behind their movements remains difficult to reconstruct. Around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean palace system began to fail. Several major centers were destroyed, abandoned, or severely diminished. Pylos burned and was never rebuilt as a palace. Mycenae and Tyre survived in some form, but their former order was broken. The causes of this collapse cannot be reduced to one event or one invading people. There may have been warfare among rival kingdoms, attacks from outside, rebellion within, earthquakes, population movement, shortages, and the unraveling of international trade. A palace economy depended on many delicate connections. When those connections failed, its centralized structure could become a source of weakness rather than strength. The collapse was not the end of human life in Greece. People did not vanish from the land. They adapted. Some settlements continued in reduced form. Others moved to more defensible locations. Farmers still sowed and harvested. Families still buried their dead, made vessels, tended animals, and passed on stories. But the scale of life changed. This great palace centers no longer commanded wide territories through their scribes and storehouses. Long-distance trade diminished. Writing disappeared from Greece for several centuries. Fine craftsmanship survived only unevenly, and population seems to have fallen in many regions. This period is often called the Greek Dark Age, a term that reflects the scarcity of written evidence rather than a complete absence of culture or human achievement. The darkness belongs partly to modern knowledge. Without palace records and monumental buildings, later historians have had less to work with. Yet archaeology reveals a changing world, not an empty one. In some areas, people remained connected through seafaring and exchange. New forms of burial, pottery, and weaponry appeared. Communities were smaller and more local, but they were also laying the foundations for a different future. In the centuries after the palace collapse, iron gradually became more common. Unlike bronze, iron did not require imported tin, though it demanded considerable skill to work effectively. Its growing use altered the material basis of society. A farmer could own an iron tool. A warrior could carry an iron weapon. Such changes did not make life easy, but they reduced dependence on the far-reaching trade systems that had supported the Bronze Age palaces. The world became less centralized and, in some ways, more resilient. The old kingship did not entirely disappear from memory, but political authority became more varied. A local leader might command respect because of family, land, courage, generosity, or skill in war. Households and kin groups mattered greatly. hospitality became an important social obligation in a world where travel could be dangerous and central authority was weak. A stranger arriving at a household might be offered food, shelter, and gifts before being questioned closely. These customs, later celebrated in epic poetry, arose from practical need as well as moral expectation. In a fragmented landscape, the bonds between host and guest could become a form of protection. At the same time, the sea continued to draw people outward. Some Greek-speaking communities migrated toward the coast of Anatolia, settling and trading along regions that would later be known as Ionia, Aeolis, and Doris. These movements were not a single organized migration, but a gradual and uneven process that unfolded across generations. Families seeking land, merchants seeking opportunity, and displaced groups seeking security all may have played a part. Across the Aegean, new settlements strengthened the ties between mainland Greece, the islands, and the Anatolian shore. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, signs of recovery became clearer. Population grew in some regions. Trade expanded again, reaching towards Cyprus, the Levant, and Italy. Pottery became more refined, decorated with careful geometric patterns of lines, circles, and meanders. Graves became more elaborate in certain communities, revealing the renewed importance of elite status. At Lefkandi, on the island of Euboea, archaeologists found a remarkable building associated with an exceptionally rich burial, including a man, a woman adorned with gold jewelry, and sacrificed horses. The structure suggests that powerful families could still command labor and ceremony, even in an age without palaces. The revival of contact with the Eastern Mediterranean brought new ideas as well as goods. Greek traders and travelers encountered Phoenician merchants, whose ships and settlements connected much of the known world. From the Phoenicians, the Greeks adapted an alphabetic writing system. This was one of the great transformations of Greek history. Linear B had been used by palace scribes for administrative purposes, but the new alphabet was simpler and more flexible. Crucially, the Greeks adapted signs to represent vowel sounds, making written language more suited to the rhythms of Greek speech. Writing would eventually allow laws, poems, lists, dedications, and public decisions to be recorded with a new permanence. At first, its use may have been limited, appearing on cups, vessels, and small objects. But its arrival marked the end of the long interval during which Greek speech had gone unwritten. The past could now be preserved in new ways. Stories once carried solely by singers, and memory could be given a more stable form. Yet oral tradition remained powerful. In the halls and gatherings of emerging communities, poets continued to sing of gods, voyages, heroes, grief, endurance, and the uncertain favor of fate. These poems were not merely entertainment. They helped create a shared imaginative world among people who remained politically divided. A farmer in a small settlement, a sailor on an island, and an aristocrat in a growing town might all hear stories of the same distant heroes. The figures of the Old Bronze Age were transformed by the needs and values of later centuries. Their world became a mirror in which Greeks could consider courage, pride, hospitality, family loyalty, and the ruin brought by anger. Through such stories, the broken memory of the Palace Age was carried forward into a new era. As communities grew, they began to take forms that would later become characteristic of Greek civilization. Small settlements gathered around defensible heights, marketplaces, and sanctuaries. Families who had once lived in dispersed villages increasingly found reasons to come together for protection, worship, trade, and political cooperation. The process was gradual and differed from region to region, but it would eventually give rise to the polis, the city-state. Greece would not become a unified kingdom. Its mountains and local traditions discouraged that outcome. Instead, it would become a mosaic of independent communities, each with its own laws, gods, rivalries, and sense of belonging. The first chapter of Greek history, then, was not a simple ascent from obscurity toward greatness. It was a sequence of worlds built, transformed, and lost. The Minoans of Crete created palace centers, open to the sea and filled with the colors of ritual and nature. The Mycenians of the mainland built fortified citadels, organized territories through bureaucracy and force, and spoke the earliest recorded Greek. Their palaces fell amid the wider turmoil of the Bronze Age collapse, leaving behind ruins, stories, and a memory of vanished kings. From the quieter centuries that followed, new communities slowly emerged. They inherited the sea routes, the sacred landscapes, the old tales, and the practical knowledge of survival. They also inherited the experience of collapse, the knowledge, perhaps deeply felt even when no longer clearly remembered, that no palace or ruler was permanent. As villages became towns and towns became self-governing communities, the Greeks would begin to define themselves in new ways. The age of scattered recovery was drawing toward a period of expansion, experiment, and restless political invention, when the many small worlds of Greece would once again turn outward across the sea. By the 8th century BCE, the long quiet after the fall of the Mycenaean palaces was beginning to give way to a new movement across the Greek world. The old citadels still stood in ruins on their hilltops, their great stones weathered by rain and sun, but the people living among those landscapes were no longer organized by palace scribes, royal storehouses, and distant kings. Their communities had become smaller, more local, and more flexible. Yet they had not forgotten the sea. Ships once again crossed the Aegean in growing numbers, carrying pottery, metals, timber, wine, oil, and the stories that traveled wherever sailors found a harbor. The recovery was gradual rather than sudden. A village might grow around a spring or a sheltered bay. A family with more land, livestock, or followers might gain influence over its neighbors. A shrine on a hill in a grove or beside a cave could become a place where scattered households came together for seasonal rites. In time, these gatherings created habits of shared worship, trade, judgment, and defense. Communities that had once been little more than clusters of kinship groups began to acquire a stronger sense of themselves as distinct political bodies. The Greeks would come to call such a community a polis. The word is often translated as city-state, though it carried a meaning broader than a city alone. A polis included its settlement, its surrounding fields and villages, its citizens, its laws, its gods, and its inherited customs. It was a homeland in miniature, bounded not only by walls or mountains, but also by shared obligations. To belong to a polis was to take part in a collective life. One might farm a small plot, serve in its militia, worship at its sanctuaries, attend its assemblies, and feel pride or resentment at its fortunes. This form of political life did not emerge everywhere in the same way. In some places, a strong aristocratic family retained influence over wide territories. In others, the population gathered more closely into an urban center. Some polis were small enough for their citizens to know one another by sight. Others, especially Athens and Sparta, would become powerful states with extensive lands and populations. But throughout the Greek world, the polis offered an answer to the fragmentation of the landscape. It allowed people to organize local loyalty without surrendering entirely to a distant monarch. The Acropolis, or High City, often formed the visible heart of a polis. In dangerous times, people could retreat there for protection. In peaceful times, it became a place of temples, treasuries, and civic memory. Below it lay the settlement itself. Houses built along uneven lanes, workshops where potters shaped vessels and metalworkers hammered bronze, fountains where women and servants collected water, and an agora, or gathering place, where goods and news changed hands. Beyond the town stretched the Chora, the cultivated countryside that sustained the community. Grain grew in the plains, vines climbed dry slopes, and olive trees rooted themselves patiently in thin soil. Most Greeks remained farmers. Their lives were governed by the seasons and by the uncertainties of weather. A poor harvest could bring hunger. A hard winter could diminish a herd. A family might own only a small plot, perhaps enough for barley, vines, a few olive trees, and animals that grazed on common land or rough hillsides. The ideal of independent farming would later become deeply important in Greek political thought, but the reality was often precarious. Land was unevenly distributed. Debt could bind a household to a wealthier neighbor. A bad season, an illness, or the demands of military service might push a family toward dependence. At the upper levels of society stood aristocratic households, whose wealth came from land, inherited status, war, and connections with other leading families. Their members hosted feasts, exchanged gifts, sponsored religious rites, and competed for honor. In their halls, guests reclined or sat around shared food and wine, while singers recalled the deeds of heroes. Such gatherings were not merely social occasions. They created alliances, settled disputes, and displayed a household's generosity. A man's reputation rested partly on his ability to provide for dependents and welcome travelers, but also on his courage in war and his skill in public speech. The values of this aristocratic world can be heard in the poetry of Homer and Hesiod. The Homeric epics, shaped over generations and committed to writing sometime in this era, described a heroic past of kings, warriors, voyages, and household loyalties. They did not provide a straightforward account of the Bronze Age. Instead, they blended memories of distant Mycenaean splendor with the concerns of the later world in which the poems took form. Their heroes quarreled over honor, feared shame, sought glory, and depended on the uncertain favor of gods. For listeners in an emerging Greek polis, these stories offered more than entertainment. They presented a language for thinking about leadership, justice, kinship, loss, and the proper conduct of hosts and guests. Hesiod, writing from the farming region of Boeotia, gave a different voice to the age. His poems spoke of work, hardship, inheritance, and the moral dangers of greed. In his world, the farmer rose early, watched the seasons, and depended upon effort as much as fortune. He warned against corrupt judges and powerful men who bent justice to serve themselves. The concerns were humble, but they were not small. As Greek communities grew more settled and unequal, questions of land, labor, and fairness became central to public life. The new Greek world was also being reshaped by contact with peoples beyond its shores. Phoenician merchants, skilled sailors from the cities of the Levant, traveled widely across the Mediterranean. Their vessels brought finely worked goods, purple-dyed cloth, ivory, metal objects, and ideas. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to write their own language, adding symbols for vowel sounds. With this innovation, Greek writing could record speech with a flexibility that the old palace scripts had never possessed. At first, writing appeared in modest forms, a name scratched on a cup, a dedication left at a sanctuary, a mark of ownership on a vessel. But its possibilities were immense. Laws could be displayed in public. Agreements could be recorded. Poets could preserve long compositions beyond the memory of a single singer. Public life would increasingly become a matter not only of spoken custom, but of written words visible to those able to read them. The alphabet did not make Greek society equal, and literacy remained limited, but it gave communities a new means of preserving and debating their own order. As population increased, the pressure upon land became more severe. The Greek mainland could be fertile in favored valleys, but much of it was mountainous and dry. Inheritance often divided family holdings into smaller portions. Wealthier landowners acquired more property, while poorer farmers struggled to maintain their independence. For some, the answer lay beyond the horizon. From the 8th century BCE onward, Greeks established settlements across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. These settlements are often called colonies, but the word can suggest a level of control that did not always exist. Many were new communities founded by people leaving an older polis, sometimes with its formal blessing, sometimes in response to internal tension. A leader known as an oikist guided the expedition, chose or negotiated for a site, and became a revered founder after death. The departing settlers carried sacred fire from the mother city's hearth, preserving a spiritual connection to the place they had left. Yet their new city was usually politically independent. It would develop its own laws, alliances, rivalries, and ambitions. Greek settlements appeared along the coast of southern Italy and Sicily, regions that later writers would call Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Others arose on the shores of the Black Sea, where grain, fish, timber, and slaves could be exchanged. Still others were founded in North Africa, southern France, Spain, and along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. The sea routes became busier, and Greek pottery began to appear in distant ports. A man from Euboea might trade in Italy. A merchant from Corinth might sail toward the Adriatic. A farmer's younger son might leave home entirely and become a citizen of a new city on a foreign shore. The settlement of these new lands was rarely simple or peaceful. Greeks encountered communities already living there. Italians, Cycles, Thracians, Scythians, Phoenicians, and many others. Sometimes they traded and intermarried. Sometimes they took land through force. Sometimes they occupied a site with the agreement of local rulers, only to become rivals in later generations. The Greek world was expanding, but it was not carrying an empty civilization into empty spaces. It was entering a wider Mediterranean already rich with languages, beliefs, and political traditions. This expansion changed the older cities as much as it changed the new ones. Trade created opportunities for ship owners, merchants, craftsmen, and producers of goods that could travel well, especially oil, wine, and painted pottery. Corinth, located on the narrow isthmus joining the Peloponnese to the mainland, benefited greatly from its position between two seas. Ships could unload goods on one side of the isthmus and have them carried across to the other, avoiding the long and dangerous voyage around the southern Peloponnese. Corinthian potters developed styles admired far beyond Greece, while its merchants grew prosperous through trade. On the island of Euboea, cities such as Chalcis and Eretria became active participants in overseas settlement and commerce. In Ionia, along the western coast of Anatolia, Greek cities flourished through their closeness to the wealth of Asia Minor and the eastern Mediterranean. Miletus, one of the greatest of these cities, founded or supported many settlements around the Black Sea. The Greek world was no longer confined to the mainland and islands. It had become a broad network of communities connected by language, cult, trade, and memory, but divided by political independence. The Greeks gradually developed a stronger awareness that, despite their differences, they shared certain things. They spoke related dialects. They worshipped gods with familiar names. They honored similar customs of sacrifice, hospitality, and burial. They told stories of Troy, Heracles, and the wanderings of heroes. Yet this common identity did not create unity. A Corinthian did not cease to be Corinthian because he shared a language with an Athenian. A Spartan did not regard the interests of distant Ionians as more important than those of Sparta. Greek identity existed alongside, and often beneath, intense local loyalty. Shared sanctuaries helped give that broader identity a visible form. At Olympia, in the western Peloponnese, Greeks gathered to honor Zeus. The sanctuary lay in a quiet river valley beneath the slopes of Mount Kronos. Over time, athletes came from many cities to compete in running, wrestling, boxing, horse racing, and other contests. Victors received little more than an olive wreath, but the honor attached to victory was immense. Their names would be celebrated at home, and their success could bring prestige to their entire community. The Olympic festival was not a meeting of peaceful nations in the modern sense. Greek cities remained capable of war even during sacred occasions, and the truce associated with the games did not end every conflict. Still, the gathering gave men from distant places an opportunity to stand in the same sanctuary, witness the same sacrifices, and recognize the breadth of the Hellenic world. The four great Pan-Hellenic festivals at Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, and Isthmia would become important markers in the rhythm of Greek life. Delphi held an especially powerful place in the Greek imagination. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, overlooking a dramatic valley of olive groves, stood the sanctuary of Apollo. People came there to seek guidance from the god through the Pythia, Apollo's priestess. Seated above a sacred cleft, she gave responses that priests interpreted and set into words. Cities consulted Delphi before founding settlements, beginning wars, changing laws, or responding to crises. Individuals came with private questions about marriage, travel, illness, and inheritance. The oracle's answers were often difficult to interpret, and the sanctuary did not determine Greek history by itself. But Delphi mattered because it provided a place beyond any single polis, where decisions could be placed before divine authority. Treasuries built by rival cities lined the sacred way, filled with offerings from victories, trade, and devotion. A visitor climbing toward Apollo's temple would see the wealth and pride of many Greek communities gathered on one steep mountainside. Their competition was visible, but so too was their shared recognition that the gods, or at least the sacred places of the gods, stood above local boundaries. Religious life was woven into daily life. There was no separate institution called a church, no single book of revelation, and no unified priesthood that governed all belief. Each polis maintained its own festivals, sacred laws, and ancestral cults. Families honored household gods and the dead. Farmers made offerings for rain and harvest. Sailors prayed before voyages. Soldiers sacrificed before battle. The gods of the Greeks were powerful, but not distant. They resembled human beings in their jealousy, desire, anger, and affection, though they were immortal and far stronger. Zeus ruled the sky. Athena watched over wisdom and civic order. Apollo brought prophecy and music. Artemis guarded wild places. Demeter governed grain and fertility, and Poseidon embodied the unpredictable force of the sea. Sacrifice formed the central act of public worship. An animal might be led to an altar decorated with garlands, killed in ritual fashion, and shared in a communal meal. The smoke rising from the altar was offered to the gods, while the people ate the meat. Such ceremonies joined religion, politics, and social order. To take part was to affirm membership in the community. Festivals filled the calendar with processions, contests, feasts, and performances. In a world where the divine could be sensed in storm, disease, childbirth, harvest, or sudden death, ritual offered a way to seek balance with forces beyond human control. As wealth and population grew, the old aristocratic order came under strain. Leading families still dominated many cities, but their authority was increasingly challenged by groups with new sources of influence. Merchants accumulated fortunes. Artisans became organized and indispensable. Farmers who served as soldiers demanded a greater voice in the communities they defended. The nature of warfare itself helped transform political expectations. In earlier centuries, combat had often emphasized the deeds of elite warriors, men who could afford horses, chariots, fine armor, and attendants. By the 7th century BCE, a new style of fighting became increasingly important: the hoplite battle line. A hoplite was a heavily armed infantryman equipped with a large round shield, helmet, breastplate, greaves, spear, and sword. He fought not as an isolated hero, but as part of a dense formation known as the phalanx. When opposing phalanxes met, each man's shield protected not only himself, but also part of the body of the man beside him. The line depended upon cohesion, discipline, and mutual reliance. It was a demanding form of warfare, terrifying in its closeness. Spears pressed forward, shields struck together, and the fate of the battle could turn on whether a line held its ground or gave way. The experience encouraged an ideal of citizenship based on shared duty. A farmer who could afford his own armor might believe that his contribution to the defense of the polis entitled him to a place in its decisions. This did not create democracy at once, and many hoplites remained under aristocratic leadership, but it altered the balance of power. A city could not depend only on a few noble cavalrymen if its survival rested upon a broad body of armed citizens. Political life slowly widened in some places, though the process was often contested, uneven, and violent. The tensions of the archaic age found expression in the rise of lawgivers. In several Greek communities, traditional customs were written down, and reformers attempted to settle disputes that had become too dangerous to ignore. Written law could limit the arbitrary judgment of powerful men, though it could also preserve the interests of those already in command. The very act of displaying laws in public suggested that justice belonged, at least in theory, to the whole community, rather than to the private memory of aristocratic families. Athens offered one of the clearest examples of this difficult transformation. The city occupied the plain of Attica, a region of hills, olive groves, and scattered settlements centered on the Acropolis. Its access to the sea through the port of Piraeus would later become a source of immense strength, but in the early archaic age, Athens was still one polis among many. Its political life was dominated by aristocratic clans, whose members held major offices and controlled much of the best land. For poorer Athenians, debt could become a source of misery. A farmer who borrowed grain or money after a failed harvest might be unable to repay. In some cases, debtors and even members of their families could fall into a form of bondage. The contrast between wealthy landowners and struggling cultivators created anger that threatened the stability of the polis. In the early 6th century BCE, the Athenians turned to Solon, a respected aristocrat and poet, to reform their laws. Solon did not abolish inequality, nor did he create a democracy in the later Athenian sense, but he cancelled certain debt obligations, ended debt slavery for Athenian citizens, and reorganized political rights partly according to wealth, rather than birth alone. The wealthiest still held the highest offices, but a wider portion of the citizen body gained some role in public institutions and courts. Solon hoped to balance the demands of rich and poor, preserving the polis by preventing either side from destroying the other. His reforms did not settle every conflict. Athens continued to experience rivalry among powerful families, regional factions, and ambitious leaders. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, Pisistratus seized power and became a tyrant. In Greek usage, a tyrant was not necessarily a monster. The term referred to a man who held power outside the older constitutional order. Pisistratus ruled Athens intermittently, overcoming exile and opposition to establish a durable position for himself and his family. Under Pisistratus, Athens remained divided by class and ambition, but the city also became more cohesive. The tyrant supported public works, encouraged religious festivals, and strengthened Athens's economic life. The festival of Dionysus, associated with wine, fertility, and ecstatic celebration, acquired greater civic importance. Roads and water supplies were improved. The authority of old aristocratic families was checked by the central power of the ruler. For many ordinary Athenians, tyranny may have seemed preferable to the feuds of competing nobles, at least while the ruler maintained order and avoided excessive oppression. Yet tyranny contained its own instability because it depended so heavily on the character and security of one household. After Pisistratus died, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus inherited power. The murder of Hipparchus, followed by growing fear and resentment, hardened the rule of Hippias. Eventually, with support from Spartan intervention and Athenian opposition, the tyranny was overthrown. The city now faced a question that would shape much of its later history. If no single tyrant and no narrow aristocratic circle could securely govern Athens, then who should rule? Cleisthenes, an aristocrat who emerged from the political struggles that followed, introduced reforms that changed the structure of Athenian citizenship. He reorganized the people of Attica into new tribes, drawing together residents from the coast, the plain, and the interior. This weakened the old regional and family networks that had dominated politics. A council of 500 was established, with members chosen from across the new tribes. The assembly of citizens acquired a more central role in decision-making. These reforms did not give political rights to women, enslaved people, or foreign residents, and they did not eliminate the influence of wealth or reputation. But they created the framework for a political experiment in which male citizens could participate more directly in governing their polis. While Athens was taking this path, Sparta was developing a society of a very different character. Sparta lay in the Eurotas Valley of the Peloponnese, surrounded by mountains that gave the region a degree of natural protection. Unlike Athens, it did not become known for great public buildings, commercial life, or artistic display. Its power rested upon land, military discipline, and the labor of a large subject population known as helots. The origins of Spartan society were rooted in conquest. The Spartans had taken control of Laconia, and then, after long and difficult wars, the neighboring region of Messenia. The Messenians were reduced to a dependent condition, compelled to work the land for Spartan masters. This created a profound and permanent fear within Sparta. The citizens known as Spartiates, were a minority ruling over many more helots. Their military system was not simply an expression of martial pride. It was also a response to the danger of revolt. Spartan boys entered a demanding public upbringing known as the agoge. From childhood, they were trained in endurance, obedience, physical discipline, and communal loyalty. They learned to live with limited comfort, to endure hunger and hardship, and to place the needs of the state above private desire. Adult male citizens ate in common messes and devoted much of their lives to military readiness. The ideal Spartan was not a wealthy merchant or eloquent speaker, but a steady and disciplined defender of the community. Sparta's political system was also unusual. It had two hereditary kings drawn from separate royal families who shared military and religious duties. It had a council of elders, the Gerousia, and a body of overseers called ephors, who possessed considerable authority. An assembly of citizens could approve or reject proposals, though debate and initiative remained tightly controlled. This mixed constitution, balancing kings, elders, magistrates, and citizens, later attracted admiration from observers who saw in it a model of stability. But Spartan order came at a cost. The helots lived under harsh subordination, subject to violence and humiliation. The Spartan state monitored them closely, and every citizen knew that security depended upon keeping them powerless. Spartan women possessed more freedom in some respects than women in many other Greek cities, partly because men spent so much of their lives in military institutions. They could own property, manage households, and receive physical training. Yet their lives too were shaped by the demands of a society organized above all around, producing and sustaining soldiers. Sparta was not entirely cut off from the wider Greek world. It had poets, craftsmen, religious festivals, and diplomatic relationships. In its earlier centuries, Spartan art and music had been lively and influential. But as its social system became more rigid, Sparta cultivated a reputation for austerity. Other Greeks came to see it as the opposite of Athens, disciplined rather than inventive, restrained rather than talkative, conservative rather than restless. The contrast was never absolute, but it would become one of the central tensions in Greek history. Beyond Athens and Sparta, hundreds of other polis pursued their own paths. Argos competed for influence in the Peloponnese. Corinth prospered through trade and colonization. Thebes grew powerful in the plains of Boeotia. On islands and along the coast of Asia Minor, cities developed distinctive institutions and cultural traditions. Some were ruled by aristocracies, some by tyrants, some by broader bodies of citizens. Alliances shifted constantly. A city might seek help from a neighbor one year and fight it the next. The Greek world was energetic, inventive, and deeply divided. It was also increasingly interconnected with powers beyond Greece. In the east, the kingdom of Lydia had risen in western Anatolia, rich in gold and strategically placed between Greek cities on the coast and the great states of the interior. The Lydian king Croesus became famous for his wealth, but his kingdom was eventually conquered by Cyrus the Great, ruler of Persia. Cyrus had created an empire of extraordinary scale, extending from the Iranian plateau across Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Under his successors, Persian rule would reach from Egypt to Central Asia. For the Greek cities of Ionia, the arrival of Persian authority brought both order and constraint. They remained prosperous and culturally active, but they were now subjects of an empire whose rulers governed through local elites, tribute, and military power. The Persians did not seek to erase Greek language or religion. Their imperial system was often pragmatic, allowing local communities considerable freedom in internal matters, so long as they accepted the king's authority. Yet the loss of political independence could not be easily forgotten. Across the Aegean, mainland Greek cities watched these developments with a mixture of distance and concern. Persia was vast, wealthy, and far beyond anything the small polis could match individually. Its armies drew upon many peoples and regions. Its royal roads connected provinces across enormous distances. Its kings commanded resources that no Athenian archon, Spartan king, or Corinthian magistrate could hope to equal. For a time, the empire seemed like a presence at the edge of the Greek world, powerful but not yet immediate. Still, the Aegean had never been a firm boundary. It was a shared sea, carrying merchants, exiles, envoys, and ambitions in both directions. The Greek cities of Asia Minor remained bound by language and kinship to communities on the mainland and islands. Their subjection to Persia would eventually create a crisis that could not remain confined to the Anatolian coast. In the years ahead, the competing worlds of Greek independence and Persian empire would meet in conflict, and the fragile, divided polis would be forced to consider what, if anything, they held in common. The Persian Empire reached the Aegean not as a sudden storm from an unknown horizon, but as the final extension of a power that had been expanding steadily for generations. By the late 6th century BCE, the kings of Persia ruled territories of immense variety. Their authority stretched from the valleys of the Nile to the highlands of Iran, from the shores of Anatolia toward distant regions of Central Asia. Roads, messengers, tribute, military service, and the prestige of the great king held this vast realm together. Its subjects spoke many languages and worshipped many gods, but all stood beneath the authority of a monarch whose court seemed, to the smaller Greek cities, almost unimaginably rich and remote. Along the western coast of Anatolia, however, Persian power was not remote at all. The Greek cities of Ionia lay directly within the empire's reach. Miletus, Ephesus, Samos, Chios, and the other cities of the coast had long been prosperous centers of trade, craftsmanship, and inquiry. Their harbors opened toward the Aegean, while their roads led inland toward the resources of Asia Minor. They had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs, often through aristocratic councils or local tyrants. Under Persian rule, they retained much of their local character, but their rulers now depended upon the favor of Persian officials and paid tribute to a king far away. For a time, this arrangement endured. Persian authority could be practical and accommodating when its subjects remained loyal. Yet the Greek cities did not easily forget their independence, and local rivalries made their position unstable. In 499 BCE, the city of Miletus became the center of a revolt against Persian rule. The immediate causes were tangled in the ambitions of local leaders, failed military ventures, and the resentments of communities governed through Persian-backed tyrants. But beneath these events lay a broader unease. The sense that Greek cities, however divided among themselves, were being asked to accept the will of an empire beyond their control. The Ionian leaders appealed across the sea for help. Most mainland Greek states hesitated. Sparta, cautious and distant from the eastern coast, declined to commit itself to a war against Persia. Athens and Eretria, however, sent a small number of ships. Their support was limited, but it carried great symbolic weight. Athenian and Eretrian forces joined the rebels in an attack on Sardis, the Persian administrative center in western Anatolia. The city was set on fire, though the rebels could not hold it. To the Persian king Darius, this act was an insult that required an answer. The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed. Persian armies and fleets regained control of the coast, and in 494 BCE Miletus fell after a long struggle. Its people suffered the familiar fate of defeated communities in the ancient world: death, enslavement, exile, and the loss of their city's former standing. The destruction of Miletus was mourned among Greeks far beyond Ionia. It revealed how vulnerable a single polis could be when confronted by imperial power. Yet the revolt had also drawn Athens into a conflict from which it could not easily withdraw. Darius now turned his attention toward the cities that had aided the rebels. A Persian expedition crossed the Aegean, moving through the islands and along the coast. Eretria was taken and punished. Then, in the autumn of 490 BCE, the Persian force landed on the plain of Marathon, northeast of Athens. The place was well chosen. It offered open ground for cavalry and infantry, while its bay could receive ships. Between Marathon and Athens rose hills and rough country, but the threat was clear enough. If the Persians defeated the Athenian army, the road to the city would lie open. Athens faced the crisis with few certainties. Its citizens had embraced a new political order only a generation earlier. The democracy was still fragile, its institutions untested by such danger. The city sent a messenger to Sparta, seeking aid from the state whose soldiers were considered the finest in Greece. But the Spartans, bound by a religious observance, could not march immediately. Athens would have to meet the invaders largely with its own forces, joined by the small neighboring city of Plataea. On the plain of Marathon, the Athenian commanders debated their course. Among them was Miltiades, a man with experience of Persian power from his time in the northern Aegean. He urged battle rather than waiting behind Athens's walls. The Athenians formed their hoplite line, placing particular strength on the wings and accepting a thinner center. They faced an enemy whose army included archers, infantry from several peoples, and cavalry, though the precise composition and size of the Persian force remained difficult to know. The battle that followed became one of the most enduring events in Greek memory. The Athenian line advanced across the plain, closing the distance beneath Persian arrows. At the center, the Greeks were pushed back, but their stronger wings gained ground. The Persian force was pressed toward the shore and its ships. Many died in the struggle near the water, and the survivors withdrew across the sea. The Athenians had won, not because they had destroyed the Persian Empire, but because they had shown that an imperial army could be defeated by citizens defending their own land. The victory at Marathon did more than secure Athens for the moment. It gave the city a new confidence in its institutions and its people. The farmers and craftsmen who had taken up their shields could see themselves as defenders of a political community that belonged, in some measure, to them. The battle also became a source of shared memory. Families remembered those who had died on the plain. Public monuments marked the achievement. The name of Marathon would echo through later centuries as a symbol of resistance, though the men who fought there could not know how large that memory would become. For Persia, Marathon was a setback rather than a final defeat. Darius prepared for a larger campaign, but his death and unrest elsewhere in the empire delayed the next invasion. His son, Xerxes, inherited the throne and the unfinished conflict. Over several years, he assembled a vast expedition intended not merely to punish Athens and Eretria, but to bring mainland Greece firmly beneath Persian authority. Supplies were gathered, roads prepared, and a canal cut across the peninsula of Mount Athos to avoid the dangerous waters that had wrecked an earlier fleet. The prospect of invasion forced the Greek cities into a difficult reckoning. Their mutual distrust had not disappeared. Many saw greater danger in their neighbors than in Persia. Some chose to submit in advance, offering earth and water, traditional symbols of obedience. Others tried to remain neutral, but a number of states formed an alliance under Spartan leadership. It was a fragile coalition, held together by fear, calculation, and a developing sense that the fate of Greece might be shared after all. In Athens, the years before Xerxes' arrival brought an equally important decision. A rich vein of silver had been discovered in the mines at Laurium, in the southern part of Attica. The revenue could have been distributed among citizens, providing an immediate benefit to many households. Instead, Themistocles, a far-sighted and ambitious Athenian politician, argued that the money should be used to build a fleet of triremes. His proposal was tied partly to Athens' rivalry with the nearby island of Aegina, but its consequences reached far beyond that local conflict. A trireme was a long, narrow warship, driven by 3 banks of oars. It was fast, difficult to handle, and expensive to construct and maintain. Its strength lay in coordinated movement, the rhythm of oarsmen, the judgment of the helmsman, and the force of its bronze ram. To build a fleet required timber, shipyards, trained crews, and a steady supply of labor. Athens' new naval policy transformed the city. Thousands of poorer citizens, who could not afford hoplite armor, could now serve as rowers. Their work would become essential to the city's defense, and their importance would strengthen the democratic character of Athenian life. When Xerxes' army approached in 480 BCE, its scale seemed overwhelming. Ancient accounts gave extraordinary numbers, almost certainly far beyond the reality, but there is no doubt that it was one of the largest forces ever assembled for a campaign in Greece. Soldiers came from across the empire: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Anatolians, and many others. Behind them came servants, engineers, supply trains, and a fleet drawn from the empire's maritime peoples. Xerxes crossed from Asia into Europe over bridges of boats laid across the Hellespont, the narrow strait now called the Dardanelles. The sight of the imperial host moving westward carried a message of power before any battle had begun. The Greek alliance chose to make its first serious stand at Thermopylae, a narrow passage between mountain and sea in central Greece. The route was one of the few practical roads into southern Greece. A small force under the Spartan king Leonidas took position there, supported by contingents from other cities. Nearby, the Allied fleet waited at Artemisium, hoping to prevent the Persian navy from outflanking the land defense. For several days, the narrowness of Thermopylae gave the Greeks an advantage. Persian troops could not easily use their numbers, and the heavily armed hoplites held their ground in the pass. But the position was vulnerable. A local man revealed a mountain path that led around the defenders. When Leonidas learned that the Persians were approaching from behind, he dismissed much of the allied force. He remained with his Spartans and a smaller group of allies, including Thespians, who chose to stay beside them. Their defeat was certain, but their resistance entered Greek memory as an example of duty carried to its final limit. Leonidas and his men were surrounded and killed. Thermopylae did not stop the invasion. The Persian army passed south into Greece, while the Allied fleet withdrew from Artemisium after difficult fighting at sea. Yet the sacrifice at the pass gave the Greek alliance time to prepare, and it became a powerful expression of the Spartan ideal, that a citizen's life belonged, in the last resort, to the defense of his community. For Athens, the advance of Xerxes brought a more immediate sorrow. The city could not be held against the invading army. The Athenians evacuated their population, sending women, children, elderly people, and those unable to fight to nearby islands and the Peloponnese. Many citizens boarded the ships of the fleet. The city itself was left largely empty. Persian troops entered Athens and burned the buildings on the Acropolis, including temples that had stood above the city's rocky height. For those who had watched the smoke rise from across the water, the loss must have seemed almost unbearable. Their homes, shrines, and familiar streets lay in enemy hands. The Greek fleet gathered in the narrow waters between the island of Salamis and the coast of Attica. Here, Themistocles believed the Persian navy's greater numbers would become a disadvantage. In confined waters, large fleets could lose order and room to maneuver. The Greek commanders were divided. Some wanted to withdraw toward the Peloponnese, where a defensive wall was being built across the Isthmus of Corinth. Themistocles urged them to remain. Whether through persuasion, strategy, or carefully sent messages that encouraged Xerxes to expect a Greek retreat, he succeeded in bringing the battle to Salamis. The engagement began in the early light, amid shifting currents and crowded ships. The Persian fleet entered the strait, but its formations became compressed. Greek triremes moved forward in coordinated lines, ramming enemy vessels and shearing off oars. Men fought from decks and in the water. Ships collided, turned, and sank. The battle was not a graceful contest, but a confused, exhausting struggle of wood, bronze, waves, and human endurance. By the day's end, the Persian fleet had suffered a severe defeat. Salamis did not destroy Xerxes' entire military power, but it altered the campaign. Without secure command of the sea, supplying and coordinating the vast army in Greece became more difficult. Xerxes returned to Asia, leaving a substantial force under the general Mardonius to continue the war. The following year, the struggle resumed. Mardonius tried to draw Athens away from the alliance by offering favorable terms, but the Athenians refused. Their city was again occupied and damaged, yet the alliance held. In 479 BCE, the Greek army gathered near Plataea in Boeotia. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, Megarians, and contingents from many other cities stood together. Though tensions and disagreements remained, the decisive battle unfolded after a period of maneuvering and uncertainty. When the lines finally met, the Greek hoplites proved stronger in close combat. Mardonius was killed, and his army broke apart. Around the same time, a Greek naval force won another victory at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece had passed. The wars had not been a simple contest between freedom and despotism, as later Greek storytellers often portrayed them. The Persian Empire was complex, and many Greeks had fought on its side or accepted its authority. The Greek alliance itself was divided by fear and self-interest, yet the outcome mattered profoundly. The great empire had failed to absorb the Greek mainland, and the leading cities emerged with their confidence enlarged. Sparta had gained further renown for military discipline. Athens, through its fleet and the sacrifices of its people, had become a power no Greek state could ignore. The years after the Persian Wars opened a new age for Athens. The immediate danger from Persia remained in the Aegean, where many Greek cities still faced Persian garrisons or feared a renewed attack. In 478 BCE, Athens formed an alliance with the islanders and the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The alliance met on the sacred island of Delos, where its treasury was kept in the sanctuary of Apollo. Members contributed ships or money for the common defense. At first, the arrangement appeared voluntary and mutual. Athens provided leadership because its fleet was strongest, and because many Eastern Greeks preferred Athenian protection to Spartan command. But an alliance of unequal partners rarely remains equal for long. Some cities chose to contribute money instead of ships, allowing Athens to build and crew an ever larger navy. When members later attempted to leave the alliance, Athens often compelled them to remain. Garrisons were imposed, tribute was assessed, rebellions were suppressed. The treasury was eventually moved from Delos to Athens itself. What had begun as a defensive league became an Athenian empire. The tribute from allied cities helped finance the fleet that protected Athenian interests across the Aegean. It also transformed life in Athens. The port of Piraeus expanded into one of the busiest harbours in the Greek world. Grain arrived from the Black Sea. Timber, metals, fish, pottery, perfume, textiles, and enslaved people passed through its markets. Foreign merchants and resident workers lived beside Athenian citizens. Shipbuilders, sailmakers, dock labourers, bankers, and traders found employment in the busy streets near the water. The city itself grew more crowded and more varied. On the Pnyx, an open hillside near the Acropolis, male citizens gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on war, alliances, laws, and public expenditure. Service on juries and in public offices became part of civic life. Payment for some forms of public service enabled poorer citizens to participate more fully. This democracy was limited and unequal by modern standards. Women were excluded from political decision-making. Enslaved people, who performed much of the labor that sustained the city, had no civic rights. Resident foreigners contributed greatly to Athenian commerce and culture but could not vote. Yet among citizens, the system created a remarkable degree of direct political involvement. Athenian democracy could be noisy, unstable, and vulnerable to persuasive speakers. It could make harsh decisions, impose severe punishments, and treat allies with the confidence of an empire. Still, it encouraged a habit of public argument unlike anything seen in most contemporary states. A farmer from Attica, a sailor from Piraeus, and a wealthy landowner could stand in the same assembly, though not with equal influence, and hear questions of war and policy debated before them. During the middle decades of the 5th century BCE, Athens reached a height of cultural and political prestige. Pericles, one of its most influential leaders, guided the city through much of this period. He came from an aristocratic family, yet he understood the power of the democratic assembly and cultivated the support of ordinary citizens. Under his influence, Athens strengthened its naval empire and began a great rebuilding program on the Acropolis. The Parthenon rose above the city in white marble, dedicated to Athena, the goddess regarded as Athens's protector. Its sculpted decoration showed gods, heroes, and the civic religious life of the Athenians themselves. Nearby stood other temples, gateways, and statues, creating a sacred landscape that announced the city's confidence. The buildings were financed in part by resources drawn from the empire, a fact that revealed both the brilliance and the burden of Athenian power. To an Athenian citizen, the Acropolis might have seemed a monument to collective achievement. To a tribute-paying ally, it could appear as a reminder of subordination. Athens became a center of drama, philosophy, art, and historical inquiry. In the theatre of Dionysus, beneath the southern slope of the Acropolis, citizens gathered for dramatic festivals. Tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored war, family loyalty, divine justice, grief, and the dangerous limits of human pride. Their stories often drew upon old myths, but they spoke to the tensions of contemporary civic life. Comedy, especially in the work of Aristophanes, could be sharper and more irreverent, mocking public figures and popular habits. The freedom to criticize did not mean that Athens was always tolerant, but its public culture was unusually open to debate and examination. Elsewhere in Greece, the rise of Athens caused growing anxiety. Sparta had watched Athenian naval expansion with suspicion. The two states represented different kinds of power. Athens depended on ships, commerce, tribute, and democratic participation. Sparta depended on land, military training, and the subordination of the Helots. Athens led an empire across the sea. Sparta stood at the center of a network of Peloponnesian allies. Neither could easily accept the other's predominance. The first serious clashes between the two powers occurred in the middle of the 5th century, but a temporary peace postponed a full confrontation. Beneath the surface, however, distrust continued to deepen. Athens built long walls connecting the city to Piraeus, ensuring access to the sea even if Attica were invaded. To Sparta and its allies, these walls made Athens seem not only powerful, but almost unassailable. Athens, for its part, believed that its security depended upon preserving naval strength and holding its empire together. The final break came in 431 BCE, beginning the long conflict known as the Peloponnesian War. It was not caused by a single insult or battle. It grew from years of rivalry, disputes among allies, commercial competition, fear, and the conviction on both sides that yielding would bring greater danger. Sparta and its Peloponnesian League faced Athens and its empire. Most Greeks understood that the war would be difficult, but few could have foreseen how deeply it would exhaust the entire Greek world. Sparta's strategy was straightforward. Its army would invade Attica, ravaging crops and trying to force the Athenians into a land battle. Athens' strategy, shaped by Pericles, was to avoid meeting Spartan hoplites on open ground. The people of the Attic countryside would withdraw behind the city's walls, while the Athenian fleet raided the Peloponnese and maintained the maritime empire. In theory, Athens could endure as long as supplies reached Piraeus by sea. The strategy had a terrible human cost. Each year, as Spartan forces entered Attica, farmers watched their fields and orchards destroyed. Families crowded into the city, living in temporary shelters, public spaces, and the homes of relatives. Athens, once spread across a landscape of villages and farms, became densely packed behind its walls. In these conditions, disease spread rapidly. A plague struck the city in 430 BCE and returned in subsequent years. Its exact nature remains uncertain, but its effects were devastating. Thousands died, including Pericles himself. The plague did more than reduce Athens' population. It damaged confidence in the city's laws, rituals, and leadership. People who had expected order found themselves surrounded by death. Traditional burial customs broke down under the pressure of so many bodies. Some lost faith in the gods. Others became more desperate in their observance. The war, which had begun as a calculation of strategy and alliance, entered the private world of households and grief. Athens remained powerful despite these losses. Its fleet continued to operate, and its empire still provided resources. But the war became increasingly brutal. At Plataea, a small ally of Athens was besieged by Spartan and Theban forces. On the island of Corcyra, civil conflict erupted between democratic and oligarchic factions, producing killings, betrayals, and acts of revenge. In city after city, the larger war encouraged local factions to seek support from Athens or Sparta. political disagreement became entangled with fear, class resentment, and personal score settling. The conflict revealed how fragile the ideals of the polis could be under extreme pressure. Communities that had prided themselves on law and civic order found themselves divided between those who favored democratic rule and those who preferred oligarchy. Neither label always meant the same thing from one city to another, but the struggle often involved the question of whether a narrow group of wealthy men or a broader body of citizens should govern. Foreign alliances gave each faction an incentive to treat its opponents not as fellow citizens with differing views, but as enemies within the walls. Athens's treatment of some rebellious allies showed the harsher side of empire. When the island of Melos, a small community that wished to remain neutral, refused to submit to Athenian demands, the Athenians besieged it. After its surrender, the men were killed and the women and children enslaved. The episode became a grim example of the logic of power in wartime. Athens, which had once celebrated resistance to Persian invasion, could now impose its will upon weaker Greeks with ruthless force. In 415 BCE, the Athenians undertook their most ambitious and disastrous venture, an expedition to Sicily. The city of Syracuse, a powerful Greek settlement on the island, had become involved in local disputes, and Athenian leaders saw an opportunity for expansion. Some hoped that conquering Sicily would bring enormous wealth and weaken Sparta's allies in the west. Others warned that the expedition was reckless, requiring resources Athens could scarcely spare. The assembly chose war. The fleet that sailed from Piraeus was one of the grandest ever sent out by Athens. Triremes moved from the harbour beneath fluttering sails, carrying soldiers, rowers, officers, supplies, and the hopes of families who watched from the shore. Yet the expedition was troubled almost from the beginning. Political rivalries at home damaged its leadership. In Sicily, Athens encountered determined resistance from Syracuse and its allies. The campaign dragged on, while Spartan support helped strengthen the Syracusans. Eventually, the Athenian army and fleet were trapped in the harbour of Syracuse. The attempt to escape failed. Ships were destroyed, soldiers were killed or captured, and the survivors endured dreadful marches through hostile country. Many Athenian prisoners died in the stone quarries of Syracuse, exposed to heat, cold, hunger, and disease. The Sicilian expedition was not merely a military defeat. It shattered the sense that Athens's resources and intelligence could overcome every obstacle. After Sicily, the war entered its final bitter phase. Athens faced rebellions among its allies, financial strain, and the intervention of Persia, which provided support to Sparta in return for influence over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Sparta, once primarily a land power, began to build a capable fleet under commanders such as Lysander. Athens experienced internal political upheaval, including a brief oligarchic coup in 411 BCE. The democracy was restored, but its authority had been weakened by the crisis. The end came in 405 BCE, when the Athenian fleet was surprised and defeated at Aegospotami near the Hellespont. With its ships gone, Athens could no longer secure the grain routes on which it depended. Spartan forces blockaded the city. Hunger spread within the walls. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the sound of Spartan celebration, and the empire that had dominated the Aegean was dismantled. Sparta imposed an oligarchic regime known as the 30, whose rule became infamous for executions, confiscations, and the persecution of political opponents. Many Athenians fled into exile. Yet the regime did not last. Democratic exiles returned, gathered support, and overthrew the oligarchs within a year. Athens restored its democracy, chastened but resilient. It would never again command the empire it had held in the age of Pericles, but its civic and cultural life endured. Sparta emerged from the Peloponnesian War as the leading power in Greece, but victory brought burdens it was poorly suited to bear. It attempted to govern former Athenian allies through garrisons and compliant rulers, often alienating the very cities it claimed to liberate. Its own citizens were too few to sustain a wide empire easily. In Asia Minor, Sparta briefly fought Persia, but Persian money and diplomacy soon helped turn Greek states against Spartan dominance. The 4th century BCE became an age of shifting hegemonies. Athens recovered some influence through a new naval alliance, though it was more cautious than before. Corinth, Argos, Thebes, and Persia all played roles in the continuing contests. The old pattern remained. No Greek state could accept permanent subordination, yet none could establish lasting leadership without provoking resistance. Thebes, long overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, rose to prominence under leaders such as Epaminondas and Pelopidas. In 371 BCE, at Leuctra, the Theban army defeated Sparta in a battle that overturned assumptions about Spartan invincibility. The Thebans used a deepened formation on one wing to strike with concentrated force against the Spartan line. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed, and the defeat was severe. For the first time in generations, Sparta's dominance in the Peloponnese was broken. Epaminondas invaded the Peloponnese and helped free Messenia from Spartan control. For the Helots and their descendants, who had labored under Spartan domination for centuries, this was a moment of profound change. A new city, Messene, was founded beneath the mountain of Ithome, protected by formidable walls. Sparta's economic foundation was damaged, for it had depended upon Messenian land and labor. Though Sparta remained a respected military society, it never fully recovered its former position. Theban power, however, was also brief. Epaminondas died in battle at Mantinea in 362 BCE, and no city emerged with unquestioned authority afterward. Greece had become weary from generations of war. The cities retained their pride, their traditions, and their capacity for remarkable art and thought, but they were politically divided and militarily depleted. Mercenaries became more common. Diplomacy grew more intricate. The old ideal of the independent polis remained powerful, yet the conditions that had once sustained its freedom were changing. North of the traditional centers of Greek life lay Macedon, a kingdom of broad plains, wooded hills, and frontier regions. For many southern Greeks, Macedonia had long seemed peripheral, a land of kings, horsemen, and peoples not fully part of the polished civic world of the polis. But this view would prove dangerously complacent. Macedon possessed resources that many southern states lacked, including timber, pasture, metals, and room to expand. Its rulers also observed the struggles of the Greek cities and learned from them. In the middle of the 4th century BCE, Philip II came to the Macedonian throne. He inherited a kingdom threatened by rivals and neighboring enemies, but he proved to be a ruler of unusual patience, intelligence, and determination. Philip reorganized the Macedonian army, strengthening its infantry with long spears known as sarissas, and combining it with powerful cavalry. He used marriage alliances, diplomacy, bribery, siegecraft, and force with equal flexibility. While the Greek cities argued, formed leagues, and mistrusted one another, Philip steadily extended Macedonian influence. His rise did not go unnoticed. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes warned repeatedly that Macedonian power threatened the independence of the Greek cities. Others believed compromise was wiser, or hoped that Philip's ambitions could be directed elsewhere. The old divisions persisted. By the time Athens and Thebes formed a final alliance against him, Philip had already become the dominant force in northern and central Greece. In 338 BCE, the armies met at Chaeronea in Boeotia. The battle ended in Macedonian victory. Among Philip's forces was his young son Alexander, whose role in the fighting brought him early distinction. Athens and Thebes had fought to preserve the old independence of the polis, but their defeat marked the end of an era. Greece would continue to possess its cities, its assemblies, its local customs, and its proud memories. Yet the political future of the Greek world would now be shaped by the Macedonian monarchy. Philip organized the Greek states, apart from Sparta, into a league under Macedonian leadership. He presented himself as the leader of a united Greek campaign against Persia, drawing upon the old memory of invasion and resistance. Before he could undertake that expedition, he was assassinated in 336 BCE. The task passed to Alexander, still young, but already trained in war, politics, and the demanding inheritance of his father. The long age of independent city-states had not vanished completely, but it had been transformed. From the ruins of Mycenaean palaces to the crowded assemblies of Athens, from Spartan discipline to the drama of the Acropolis, the Greeks had created forms of political and cultural life that would outlast their freedom. Now, the fractured energies of Greece were about to be carried eastward by a Macedonian king, across the lands of the Persian Empire, and toward horizons no Greek army had previously reached. Alexander inherited the throne of Macedon in 336 BCE at the age of 20, amid a world still unsettled by the assassination of his father, Philip II. The young king had been trained for responsibility from childhood. He had learned the habits of command in the Macedonian court, ridden beside soldiers on campaign, and studied with the philosopher Aristotle, whose teaching introduced him to poetry, politics, science, and the enduring prestige of Greek culture. Yet the inheritance before him was not secure. Macedon had grown powerful under Philip, but its new supremacy rested upon alliances, fear, and recent victories. The Greek cities had not forgotten Chaeronea, and beyond Macedon's northern borders lay peoples ready to test the strength of a new ruler. Alexander moved quickly. He secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army, removed rivals, and marched south into Greece. Thebes, Athens, and other cities had begun to wonder whether Philip's death offered them a chance to escape Macedonian control. Alexander made clear that it did not. When Thebes revolted, he destroyed the city in a punishment so severe that it sent a quiet warning through the Greek world. Most of its buildings were razed, its people sold into slavery, and its territory divided. Only a few places connected with religion or poetic memory were spared. Athens, alarmed by the fate of Thebes, chose accommodation. The old independent cities remained alive, but the authority to decide the greater direction of Greece now lay in Macedonian hands. Alexander then turned toward the expedition his father had prepared, an invasion of the Persian Empire. Officially, the campaign could be presented as a Greek war of revenge, a response to the Persian invasions of a century and a half before. It could also be framed as the liberation of Greek cities in Asia Minor from Persian rule. But Alexander's ambitions reached further than vengeance or liberation. He sought conquest, wealth, renown, and a place among the heroic figures of the past. He carried with him the memory of Achilles, the warrior of Homeric poetry, and is said to have visited Troy before beginning the campaign. In the ruined landscape of the old epic world, he made offerings at the tombs of heroes and imagined his own life as part of a story that might outlast death. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont from Europe into Asia with an army that was formidable but not vast by Persian standards. His core force consisted of Macedonian infantry armed with long pikes, the sarissas, which could project several ranks beyond the front of a dense formation. Beside them marched Greek allies, mercenaries, light troops, engineers, and the elite companion cavalry, noble horsemen trained to strike where the battle line weakened. This army had been shaped by Philip's reforms. It combined discipline, mobility, siegecraft, and a command structure capable of responding quickly in battle. The first major encounter came at the river Granicus in northwestern Anatolia. Persian satraps, the provincial governors of the empire, gathered a force to stop Alexander before he could move deeper into Asia Minor. The battle was fought near the riverbank, where the crossing itself was dangerous and the opposing cavalry waited on higher ground. Alexander led from the front, as he would repeatedly throughout his career. The fighting was close and confused, but the Macedonian army prevailed. The victory opened western Anatolia to him. In the months that followed, Alexander moved along the coast, taking cities and accepting the submission of others. For the Greek communities of Ionia, Macedonian arrival could be welcomed as release from Persian rule, though the realities of military occupation and political rearrangement were rarely simple. Alexander removed some local tyrants and encouraged civic institutions favorable to his cause. He also had to secure ports and supply lines, for an army advancing through hostile territory could not survive on glory alone. Grain, water, animals, wagons, roads, bridges, and the labor of local populations mattered as much as battlefield courage. The Persian king Darius III now gathered a larger army and came westward to meet the invader. The two rulers confronted one another at Issus in 333 BCE, near the narrow coastal plain between the mountains of southern Anatolia and the Mediterranean Sea. The terrain limited the Persian advantage in numbers. Alexander placed himself on the right wing with the companion cavalry and drove toward the center, where Darius stood in his royal chariot. As the Macedonian advance pressed forward, the Persian king withdrew from the field. His departure caused panic among parts of his army, and the battle became a Macedonian victory. Among the captives taken after Issus were members of Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated them with a degree of formal respect, recognizing their royal status. Such gestures were not merely expressions of personal generosity. They served political purpose. Alexander was not only defeating Persian forces, he was beginning to present himself as a possible successor to Persian kingship. He would increasingly adopt the language, symbols, and practices of the empire he was conquering, a choice that later caused unease among many Macedonians, who preferred to see themselves as victors rather than heirs to an Eastern monarchy. After Issus, Alexander did not pursue Darius immediately into the interior. Instead, he moved south along the eastern Mediterranean coast. This was a strategic decision. The Persian navy still possessed strength, especially through the fleets of Phoenician cities. By taking the coastal ports, Alexander could deny Persian naval bases and secure his own connection to the Mediterranean. One by one, cities submitted or were taken. Some opened their gates peacefully. Others resisted, aware that surrender meant accepting a new master and the demands of an army on campaign. The most difficult siege occurred at Tyre, a wealthy Phoenician city built partly on an island just offshore. The Tyrians were prepared to resist, trusting in their walls and their command of the sea. Alexander's army had no easy way to reach them. He responded with astonishing persistence. A causeway was built from the mainland toward the island, using stone and timber. The defenders attacked it with fire and missiles. Alexander gathered ships from other Phoenician ports and created a fleet capable of surrounding the city. Siege engines battered the walls while divers and sailors struggled beneath them. For months, the siege continued. Soldiers labored in heat and salt wind, hauling material, repairing damaged works, and waiting for the next assault. Inside Tyre, families endured fear, rationing, and the growing knowledge that their city might not withstand the assault forever. When Alexander finally broke through in 332 BCE, the punishment was harsh. Many inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery. The fall of Tyre was a warning to others, but it also revealed something about Alexander's method of rule. He could offer generous terms to those who submitted, yet he could be relentless toward resistance that challenged his authority. From Tyre, Alexander continued south to Gaza, another fortified city that resisted and was taken after a difficult siege. Then he entered Egypt. Unlike the cities of the Levant, Egypt had long been a rich province of the Persian Empire, but Persian rule had not always been popular there. Alexander was welcomed by many as a liberator. He traveled along the Nile, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and accepted the ancient titles of Egyptian kingship. To the people of Egypt, he could appear not merely as a Macedonian conqueror, but as a pharaoh, a legitimate ruler within their own sacred tradition. On the Mediterranean coast, near the western edge of the Nile Delta, Alexander founded a city that would bear his name, Alexandria. Its location was carefully chosen, between the sea and Lake Mareotis, near the island of Pharos. The city was intended to be a port, an administrative center, and a link between Egypt, Greece, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Its streets were laid out in a grid, broad avenues crossing one another, with an order that suggested confidence in the future. At the time, it was only a plan marked upon the ground. Yet, in later generations, Alexandria would become one of the great cities of the ancient world, a place of libraries, temples, markets, palaces, workshops, and ships arriving from every horizon. Alexander also journeyed west through the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The route was difficult and the destination remote, an oasis far from the cultivated Nile Valley. The Oracle was associated by Greeks with Zeus and by Egyptians with the god Amun. What was said there remains uncertain, filtered through stories told long afterward. But the visit strengthened the idea that Alexander's rule possessed divine favor. In an age when kingship and religion were closely intertwined, such recognition carried immense political meaning. By 331 BCE, Alexander was ready to face Darius again. He marched northeast through Syria and Mesopotamia, crossing great rivers and moving toward the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius had assembled another army, choosing open ground near Gaugamela, in the region of modern northern Iraq. There, the Persians could make fuller use of cavalry, chariots, and numbers. The ground was prepared for battle, flattened to allow chariots to move freely. For Alexander's army, the sight of the Persian host must have been daunting. It stretched across the plain, composed of troops from many provinces, gathered beneath the banners of the great king. Before the battle, Alexander's officers debated whether to attack at night. He refused, perhaps because he wished to avoid confusion, perhaps because he wanted victory in full daylight. At dawn, the Macedonian line advanced carefully. Darius sent chariots forward, but the Macedonians opened gaps and neutralized many of them. On the right, Alexander led a diagonal movement that drew part of the Persian cavalry away from the center. Then, seeing an opening, he charged with the companion cavalry toward Darius himself. The decisive moment followed a familiar pattern. Darius withdrew as the danger approached, and his army began to lose cohesion. Yet the battle was not simple or effortless. On other parts of the field, Macedonian forces faced serious pressure. The Persian cavalry broke through in places, and Alexander had to turn back from pursuit to support his threatened troops. Still, by evening, the Persian army had been defeated. Gaugamela ended the Achaemenid Empire as the dominant power of Western Asia. Alexander entered Babylon, one of the oldest and most magnificent cities in the world. Its walls, temples, canals, and crowded streets belonged to a civilization far older than Macedon. Here, he presented himself as a successor to the Persian kings, preserving local administration where possible, and making offerings to Babylonian gods. He continued eastward to Susa, another royal center, and then to Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian monarchy. The treasures seized from Persian palaces were enormous. Gold, silver, crafted goods, and accumulated tribute flowed into Macedonian hands, changing the wealth of the Greek world. At Persepolis, the palace complex was later burned. Ancient accounts offered different explanations. Some described it as deliberate revenge for the Persian destruction of Greek temples during the invasion of Xerxes. Others suggested it began amid a drunken celebration and became a symbolic act afterward. Whatever the immediate cause, the burning marked a rupture with the old Persian dynasty. Yet Alexander did not intend simply to destroy the empire he had conquered. He needed its roads, officials, taxes, cities, and traditions. He began to recruit Persians into positions of responsibility and adopted elements of Persian court ceremony. This policy troubled many Macedonians. They had crossed into Asia as conquerors, and they expected wealth, land, and honor. They did not always welcome Persian nobles beside them at court or in the army. They were uneasy when Alexander wore Persian dress on, ceremonial occasions or required forms of obeisance that seemed proper before an Eastern king, but humiliating to free Macedonians and Greeks. Alexander's empire was becoming too vast to be ruled only through the customs of a small northern kingdom. But the attempt to build a new order from Macedonian and Persian elements brought tension into his closest circle. Darius had escaped from Gaugamela and fled eastward, hoping to gather support in the Iranian plateau. Alexander pursued him, crossing mountains and deserts in an exhausting campaign. Before he could capture the Persian king, Darius was murdered by one of his own commanders, Bessus. Alexander found the dying king and treated his body with royal respect. Darius was buried according to Persian custom, while Alexander declared himself his avenger. In this way, the Macedonian conqueror claimed not only the lands of the Persian Empire, but also the moral right to succeed its fallen ruler. The campaigns that followed took Alexander into Bactria and Sogdiana, regions of high mountains, dry plains, and fortified settlements. Here, conquest became more difficult. There were no single capitals whose capture could settle the region. Resistance continued through local leaders, mobile cavalry, and strongholds placed in remote terrain. Alexander founded garrisons and cities, often named Alexandria, to secure routes and house veterans. His army endured long marches, harsh weather, and the fatigue of years spent far from home. In these eastern provinces, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The marriage may have involved affection, but it also had political significance. By joining himself to a local elite family, Alexander signaled that his empire would not rest solely on Macedonian force. Later, at Susa, he arranged a mass marriage between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen. Such gestures reflected his vision, or perhaps his practical need, for a ruling class that could bridge the cultural divides of his empire. Not everyone accepted this vision. Alexander's court became a place of suspicion as well as splendor. Old companions who had fought beside him since the beginning found themselves uneasy with the king's changing habits. Parmenion, one of Philip's most experienced generals, had served Alexander faithfully through the early victories. When Parmenion's son Philotas was accused of conspiracy, Alexander ordered Philotas executed. Soon afterward, Parmenion himself was killed, likely because Alexander feared that he might retaliate. The episode showed how the atmosphere of conquest could turn trust into danger. Another painful incident involved Clytus, a Macedonian officer who had once saved Alexander's life in battle. During a banquet, after wine and argument had sharpened old resentments, Clytus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and reminded him of Philip's achievements. Alexander, overcome by anger, killed him with a spear. He later mourned deeply, but the event could not be undone. It revealed the strain within a court where a young king, praised as almost divine by some, was increasingly separated from the men who had known him before empire. In 327 BCE, Alexander led his army toward India. The lands beyond the Hindu Kush had been known to the Persians, but for Macedonians, they seemed to lie at the edge of the known world. The campaign crossed difficult mountain routes and descended into the valleys of the Indus tributaries. Local rulers made different choices. Some submitted, hoping to preserve their positions. Others resisted fiercely. The geography itself became an adversary. Rivers in flood, heat, rain, dense vegetation, and unfamiliar animals altered the experience of war. At the Hydaspes River, Alexander fought King Porus, whose army included war elephants. The battle was difficult and costly. Alexander crossed the river in secret during a storm and attacked from an unexpected position. The Macedonian cavalry and infantry eventually overcame Porus's forces, but Alexander was impressed by the defeated king's bearing. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus is said to have answered, "As a king." Alexander allowed him to continue ruling, enlarging his territory under Macedonian authority. The story, whether perfectly preserved or not, reflected the political realism that had often guided Alexander. A conqueror could not rule every land through destruction alone. Beyond the Hydaspes lay further kingdoms, and Alexander wished to continue eastward. His soldiers did not. They had marched for years, crossed deserts and mountains, watched friends die, and traveled farther from Macedon than any of them had imagined. On the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused to advance. Alexander withdrew into his tent, hoping perhaps that their resolve would weaken. It did not. At last, he accepted that even a king with extraordinary authority could not compel an exhausted army to follow forever. The return journey was severe. Part of the force traveled down the Indus by ship, while others marched through the harsh Gedrosian desert along the coast of what is now southern Iran and Pakistan. The desert crossing brought terrible losses from thirst, hunger, heat, and exhaustion. Alexander shared many hardships with his men, but his ambition had carried them into a landscape where courage could not overcome nature. The army emerged diminished, carrying the memory of a journey that had stretched the boundaries of their world and nearly broken them. When Alexander returned to the central regions of his empire, he found that the difficulties of governing had multiplied. Some officials had abused their power. Some local populations had rebelled. Some Macedonian settlers and soldiers had grown restless. Alexander punished corrupt administrators, reorganized provinces, and continued to recruit men of Persian and other backgrounds into his army. At Opis, near Babylon, he announced that Macedonian veterans who were no longer fit for service would be sent home with rewards. Instead of gratitude, many interpreted the decision as evidence that he intended to replace them with Asians. The resulting mutiny was one of the few moments when Alexander's authority was openly challenged by his own troops. He confronted the soldiers with anger, reminding them of the hardships Philip had endured and the victories they had won together. For a time, he withdrew from them and promoted Persian officers. The Macedonians, afraid of losing their special place, eventually sought reconciliation. The settlement that followed was marked by a great banquet at which Macedonians, Persians, and other peoples ate together. It was a powerful symbol. Those symbols could not erase all resentment. In 323 BCE, Alexander arrived in Babylon, perhaps intending to make it the center of a more stable empire. He was 32 years old. His plans may have included further campaigns, naval expeditions, administrative reforms, and the integration of his vast territories. But after a period of fever, he died. Ancient accounts differed over the cause. Disease is likely, though. Rumors of poisoning circulated almost immediately. His death left behind no clear adult heir capable of commanding the loyalty of the army and the empire. When asked who should inherit, Alexander is said to have replied, "To the strongest." Whether or not those were his exact words, they described the reality that followed. His half-brother Aridaeus had limited capacity to rule, and his wife Roxana was pregnant. Alexander's generals, known later as the successors, initially attempted to govern in the names of these royal heirs. But the empire had been held together by the force of one man's presence. Once that presence was gone, rivalry became unavoidable. The years after Alexander's death were marked by shifting alliances, assassinations, battles, and betrayals. His generals possessed armies, provinces, and personal ambitions. They fought not for a united empire, but for portions of it. Perdiccas, who first held a leading position, was killed by his own officers during a failed campaign in Egypt. Antigonus controlled much of Asia Minor and sought to reunite the empire, but was defeated and killed at Ipsus in 301 BCE. The royal family itself was gradually eliminated. Alexander's son, born after his death, was murdered while still young. Out of this violent struggle emerged several major kingdoms. In Egypt, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's companions, established a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies governed from Alexandria, combining Macedonian royal authority with Egyptian traditions of kingship. In Asia, Seleucus built a vast kingdom stretching from Syria and Mesopotamia toward Iran, though its eastern territories would prove difficult to hold. In Macedon and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty eventually established control after years of conflict. The dream of a single empire had disappeared, but Alexander's conquests had created a new political and cultural world. This was the Hellenistic Age, named for the spread and transformation of Hellenic or Greek culture across a vast region. The word should not suggest that the conquered peoples became simply Greek. Egyptians remained Egyptian, Babylonians preserved ancient customs, Jews maintained their religious traditions, and countless other communities continued to speak their own languages and live according to inherited practices. Yet Greek became a common language of administration, commerce, education, and urban life in many regions. Greek-style cities, theatres, gymnasiums, marketplaces, and institutions appeared far beyond the old limits of the Aegean. The old Greek homeland was no longer the unquestioned centre of this world. Athens remained admired for its schools, its philosophical traditions, and its monuments. Visitors still came to hear teachers speak in the shaded walks of the academy or the lyceum. Sparta retained its reputation for discipline and ancient virtue, even as its political power declined. But the greatest wealth and royal authority now lay elsewhere. In Alexandria, beside the Nile, Antioch on the Orontes, Pergamon in Asia Minor, Seleucia on the Tigris, and numerous other cities founded or enlarged under the new monarchies. These cities were places of encounter. A merchant might hear Greek spoken in the market, but bargain with an Egyptian, a Syrian, a Jew, or a man from distant Bactria. Royal officials recorded taxes in Greek. Soldiers from Macedonia settled beside local farmers. Temples honored Greek gods, local deities, and sometimes rulers themselves. In Egypt, Greek and Egyptian traditions increasingly overlapped. The god Serapis, for example, was presented in a form that could appeal to both Greek and Egyptian worshippers. Such cultural blending was never complete or free of tension, but it became one of the defining features of the age. Alexandria soon surpassed most cities in the Greek world in scale and influence. Its harbour was protected by the island of Pharos, where a great lighthouse would later guide ships toward the coast. The city became a centre of royal power and commercial energy. Grain from the fertile Nile Valley moved through its docks. Papyrus, glass, linen, spices, and luxury goods passed through markets filled with sailors, labourers, scholars, priests, and officials. The Ptolemaic kings established the Museum, a community of scholars supported by the crown, and the famous Library of Alexandria, which sought to gather writings from across the known world. In this environment, scholars edited the texts of Homer, studied mathematics and astronomy, mapped the earth, and investigated the human body. Euclid worked in Alexandria, arranging the principles of geometry with a clarity that would shape education for centuries. Eratosthenes, also associated with the city, estimated the circumference of the earth with remarkable insight. Archimedes, working in Syracuse in Sicily, explored mathematics, mechanics, and the behavior of water. The Hellenistic age was not peaceful, but its royal courts and wealthy cities created conditions in which knowledge could be collected, debated, and advanced. Art also changed. Classical Greek sculpture had often sought balance, restraint, and ideal proportion. Hellenistic artists became more interested in movement, emotion, age, suffering, and individual character. Statues showed athletes in strain, old women carrying burdens, children at play, defeated warriors, gods in dramatic motion, and faces marked by thought or pain. The world after Alexander seemed larger, more varied, and less easily contained by earlier ideals of calm perfection. Philosophy adapted to the uncertainties of the age. In the independent polis, thinkers had often asked how citizens should live within a political community. In the Hellenistic world, where individuals might live under distant monarchs or move from one city to another, philosophy increasingly addressed the inner life. The Stoics taught that virtue lay in living according to reason and accepting what could not be controlled. The Epicureans sought freedom from fear and disturbance through friendship, moderation, and understanding of nature. Skeptics questioned the certainty of human knowledge. These schools offered not escape from the world, but ways of enduring its instability. Back in Greece, the old cities struggled to preserve room for autonomy beneath the shadow of Macedonian kings. Some accepted garrisons and royal influence. Others rebelled when opportunity arose. The Athenians attempted to recover independence after Alexander's death in the Lamian War, but Macedonian forces defeated them. The consequences were severe. Athens was required to accept a garrison and restrictions on its democracy. The city remained culturally important, but the political freedom of its classical age had been greatly reduced. Other Greek communities sought strength through federations. The Aetolian League in central Greece and the Achaean League in the Peloponnese brought together cities that wished to balance local self-government with collective defense. These leagues had assemblies, councils, magistrates, and shared military arrangements. They represented an Athenian attempt to adapt the traditions of the polis to a world dominated by monarchies. A single small city might be weak, but a federation of cities could negotiate, trade, and fight with greater force. The Achaean League grew especially important in the 3rd century BCE. Under leaders such as Aratus of Sicyon, it expanded across much of the Peloponnese, sometimes through diplomacy and sometimes through force. Sparta, too, attempted reforms under kings such as Agis IV and Cleomenes III. They sought to restore the old Spartan citizen body by redistributing land and addressing the decline in the number of full citizens. These efforts reflected a deeper crisis. Wealth had become concentrated, populations had shifted, and the old social structures of the Greek cities no longer functioned as they once had. Cleomenes achieved temporary military success, but the Achaean League called upon Macedon for support. In 222 BCE, Macedonian forces defeated Sparta at Silesia. The outcome demonstrated a recurring pattern of the Hellenistic era. Greek states seeking protection from one great power against another, only to find their independence further limited. The old rivalries of Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos had not disappeared, but they now unfolded within a larger world of kings, leagues, mercenary armies, and international diplomacy. Mercenaries became increasingly common. A young man without land or prospects might enlist in the army of a Hellenistic king, travel far from home, and serve beside men speaking unfamiliar languages. War remained frequent because the successor kingdoms were rich, ambitious, and insecure. Borders changed. Dynasties married and murdered. Cities were besieged, captured, and rewarded. Yet ordinary life continued beneath these shifting struggles. Farmers planted crops, artisans worked in local workshops, families arranged marriages, and pilgrims traveled to sanctuaries. The great political map might change, but village life was still measured by rain, harvest, illness, debt, and the arrival of a son or husband from military service. In the West, a new power was rising. Rome had begun as one city among many in central Italy, but through a long series of wars it gained control over the Italian peninsula. Its armies were disciplined, its political institutions resilient, and its alliances extensive. Rome first became deeply involved in Greek affairs through southern Italy and Sicily, where Greek cities had long been established. The war against King Pyrrhus of Epirus in the early 3rd century BCE brought Roman and Greek military worlds into direct contact. Pyrrhus was a talented Hellenistic king who crossed into Italy to aid Greek cities threatened by Rome. He won victories against Roman armies, but at such cost that the phrase Pyrrhic victory would later describe success bought too dearly. Rome could replace its losses more readily than Pyrrhus could replace his. Eventually, he withdrew, and the Romans continued their expansion. The episode revealed that the old Hellenistic style of kingship, with its brilliant commanders and professional armies, could not always overcome a republic able to draw steadily upon the manpower and loyalty of a broad Italian alliance. Rome's involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean intensified during its wars with Carthage. Philip V of Macedon allied himself with Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who had invaded Italy. This drew Rome into conflict with Macedon. At first, Roman intervention in Greece was limited, but after defeating Carthage, Rome returned with greater strength. Greek states, as usual divided by their own interests, made alliances with Rome in hopes of weakening Macedonian power. In 197 BCE, a Roman army defeated Philip V at Cenocephalae in Thessaly. The battle showed the growing effectiveness of the Roman legion against the Macedonian phalanx. The phalanx was powerful on level ground when its long pikes remained aligned, but it was less flexible on broken terrain or when its formation became disordered. The Roman legion, organized in smaller units, could adapt more easily to uneven ground and changing conditions. After the victory, the Roman commander proclaimed the freedom of the Greek cities at the Isthmian Games. The announcement was greeted with enthusiasm. For many Greeks, Roman freedom sounded like release from Macedonian control. But Rome's understanding of freedom did not mean that Greek states could act without regard to Roman interests. Rome preferred a divided Greece in which no rival power could become dominant. It acted as an arbiter, a protector, and increasingly a master. Greek cities could retain local institutions, but the decisive pressure of Roman diplomacy and military power became impossible to ignore. Macedon tried again to challenge Rome. King Perseus, the son of Philip V, sought to restore Macedonian influence, alarming Rome and some Greek states. In 168 BCE at Pydna, Roman forces defeated the Macedonian army. Once more, the phalanx proved formidable until the battle's disorder created openings for more flexible Roman units. The defeat ended the Antigonid monarchy. Macedon was divided, weakened, and eventually absorbed under Roman authority. The fate of Greece itself followed soon after. The Achaean League, increasingly frustrated by Roman interference, came into open conflict with Rome. The decision was desperate and poorly judged, but it reflected the humiliation felt by Greeks who saw their political choices narrowing year by year. In 146 BCE, the Roman general Lucius Mummius defeated the Achaean forces near Corinth. The city of Corinth was destroyed, its wealth carried away, and its people killed or enslaved. The destruction was both practical and symbolic. One of Greece's great commercial cities had been made an example. Roman conquest did not erase Greek civilization. In many ways, it ensured that Greek language and culture would continue to spread. Roman elites admired Greek literature, philosophy, art, and education. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to study with Greek teachers. Greek architects, physicians, sculptors, and rhetoricians found work throughout the expanding Roman world. The Roman poet might write in Latin, but he often did so under the influence of Greek models. Roman gods were identified with Greek gods. Greek art filled Roman villas and public spaces. For Greece itself, Roman rule brought political subordination, but also a place within a vast Mediterranean system. The old conflicts among city-states no longer determined the fate of the region in the same way. Roads, sea routes, and imperial administration connected Greek cities to Italy, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Some places declined, while others revived through trade, patronage, and tourism. Corinth was rebuilt as a Roman colony and once again became a major commercial centre. Athens remained a celebrated place of learning, visited by Romans who wished to stand among the temples, schools, and memories of classical Greece. The Greeks increasingly lived in a world that was Roman in power, but Greek in many habits of thought. A Roman official in the East might speak Greek. A merchant from Syria might conduct business in Greek. A philosopher in Athens could teach Roman students in the language of Plato and Aristotle. The word Hellene continued to carry cultural meaning, even as political independence had passed away. In the 1st century BCE, Greece itself became entangled in Rome's internal civil wars. Rival Roman commanders brought armies across the eastern Mediterranean, and Greek cities were forced to choose sides or endure the consequences of their choices. Athens, having supported the wrong faction in one conflict, suffered when the Roman general Sulla captured it in 86 BCE. The city survived, but the event reminded Greeks that their homeland had become a theatre for struggles decided elsewhere. Under the Roman Empire, especially during periods of peace and stability, Greek cities experienced renewed building and civic life. Emperors and wealthy benefactors financed theatres, baths, temples, aqueducts, libraries, and public squares. The Emperor Hadrian, a great admirer of Greek culture, supported Athens and other cities with particular enthusiasm. He completed the vast temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, a project begun centuries earlier. To walk through a prosperous Greek city in the 2nd century CE was to see layers of history standing together. An ancient sanctuary, a classical theatre, a Hellenistic stoa, and a Roman bathhouse, all serving a population that belonged to several cultural worlds at once. Daily life under Rome varied widely. In a rural village, most people still lived close to the land. They cultivated grain, olives, and vines, cared for animals, and depended on local markets. In cities, craftsmen produced pottery, cloth, tools, lamps, glass, and luxury objects. Enslaved people worked in household, workshops, mines, and farms. Free citizens held local offices, competed for public honor, and financed monuments or festivals. The old civic traditions endured, but local politics now operated beneath the larger horizon of imperial rule. Religious life also remained diverse. The traditional Greek gods were still honored. Festivals continued at Olympia, Delphi, and many local sanctuaries. Mysteries at Eleusis near Athens attracted initiates seeking a deeper promise of hope beyond death. New cults from Egypt, Anatolia, Syria, and elsewhere entered Greek cities. The imperial cult encouraged subjects to honor the emperor and the ruling house, not always as gods in the same sense as Zeus or Apollo, but as sacred guardians of order and prosperity. The Mediterranean was becoming a religious crossroads. It was in this Roman-Greek world that Christianity began to spread. The new faith emerged from Jewish communities in the eastern provinces of the empire and traveled along the same roads and sea lanes that carried merchants, soldiers, and officials. Greek became one of its principal languages. Christian teachers and missionaries could move from city to city, speaking in synagogues, marketplaces, workshops, and private homes. The Apostle Paul traveled through parts of Greece preaching in places such as Philippi, Thessaloniki, Berea, Corinth, and Athens. At first, Christian communities were small and often vulnerable. Their members included artisans, women, freed people, merchants, laborers, and occasionally people of greater wealth. They gathered in houses, shared meals, cared for the poor, and formed ties that crossed ordinary boundaries of city and status. Their belief in one God and their refusal to participate fully in some civic religious practices could create suspicion. Yet the faith continued to spread, aided by the mobility and shared language of the Roman world. For centuries, Greece remained part of an empire centered politically on Rome, but increasingly oriented toward the eastern Mediterranean. The older division between Greek and Roman became less clear. Educated Romans admired Greek culture, while Greek-speaking elites participated in Roman administration. The empire's wealth, armies, and laws created a broad framework of order, though this order was periodically shaken by invasion, plague, economic strain, and civil conflict. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire entered a period of severe instability. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Frontiers came under pressure. Trade and city life suffered in many regions. Greece was affected by raids and insecurity, though its cities continued to function. The old world of the polis had long since changed, but urban communities still remained central to local identity. A city's council, festivals, markets, and temples gave shape to the lives of its inhabitants, even when ultimate authority rested far away. Then, in the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine made a decision that would redirect the future of Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. He established a new imperial capital at Byzantium, on the narrow strait between Europe and Asia. The city was renamed Constantinople. Its location was ideal for controlling routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and for governing the wealthier eastern provinces of the empire. Rome remained honored as the old capital, but the center of gravity was moving east. This movement would transform Greece's place in the world once more. The language of the Eastern Empire was increasingly Greek. Christianity was becoming central to public life. Ancient temples would gradually lose their old role, while churches, monasteries, bishops, and imperial officials reshaped the landscape. The Roman Empire in the East would endure for centuries after the Western Empire fell, carrying forward Greek culture in a Christian and imperial form. The age that followed would not forget the ancient past, but it would see that past through new faith, new institutions, and the rising splendor of Constantinople. When Constantinople became the imperial capital in the 4th century, Greece entered a new age without fully leaving its older worlds behind. The cities of the peninsula still possessed temples, theaters, marketplaces, baths, and public monuments that recalled their classical and Roman past. In Athens, the Acropolis continued to rise above the surrounding houses. In Corinth, merchants still passed through a city rebuilt under Roman power. At Olympia and Delphi, ancient sanctuaries retained their prestige, even as the beliefs that had sustained them for centuries began to change. Yet the center of political gravity had moved eastward toward the narrow waters of the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia faced one another across the strait. Constantinople was founded on the site of the older city of Byzantium. Its position was extraordinary. To the north lay the Black Sea, rich in grain, timber, fish, and trade routes. To the south lay the Mediterranean. Across the water stood Asia Minor, while the Balkan lands stretched westward behind the city. The Emperor Constantine understood that an empire increasingly dependent upon its eastern provinces required a capital closer to their wealth, population, and strategic frontiers. In 330 CE, he dedicated the rebuilt city as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. For the inhabitants of the Eastern Empire, the name Rome did not disappear. They continued to call themselves Romans, and they understood their state as the Roman Empire, governed by an emperor who inherited the authority of Caesar and Augustus. But the everyday language of much of this Eastern world was Greek. Greek was spoken in cities, written in administration, used in schools, and heard in the liturgy of the growing Christian church. Over centuries, the Roman Empire in the East would become increasingly Greek in language and culture, though it never ceased to think of itself as Roman. Christianity played a central role in this transformation. During the early centuries of Roman rule, Christians had often been small and vulnerable communities, meeting in houses and private spaces. Some periods brought tolerance, while others brought persecution. But in the early 4th century, Constantine gave Christianity legal protection, and later emperors increasingly favored it. By the end of that century, Christianity had become the empire's official religion. The old religious landscape of Greece began to change. The temples of Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and the countless local gods did not vanish in a single generation. Ancient rituals continued in some places, and many people retained older customs, long after imperial laws favored Christianity. But the public world was being rearranged. Bishops gained authority in cities. Churches rose beside old civic buildings. Monasteries appeared in countryside and wilderness. The Christian faith offered a new understanding of time, one centered not on the cycles of civic festivals or the myths of the Olympian gods, but on creation, salvation, sin, and the promise of eternal life. For many Greeks, this new faith did not feel entirely foreign. Its scriptures had circulated widely in Greek, and its early thinkers had used Greek philosophical language to explain its teachings. Christian theologians borrowed concepts from Plato and Aristotle, while also challenging the old pagan order. The human soul, virtue, justice, and the nature of the divine remained subjects of serious thought, but they were now considered within the framework of a single God and a sacred history that embraced all humanity. The ancient sanctuaries gradually lost their public role. The Olympic Games, once held in honor of Zeus, came to an end in the late 4th century. The temple complexes that had drawn pilgrims for centuries fell quiet or were transformed. Some were dismantled for building stone. Others survived as ruins, their columns standing in fields or among later settlements. The old gods did not disappear from memory. Their stories remained in poems, statues, decorative art, and the education of the learned. But they no longer governed the official rhythms of public life. The Greek lands of late antiquity were not merely places of fading monuments. They were active parts of a changing empire. Cities still mattered. Thessaloniki, on the northern Aegean coast, became one of the most important urban centers in the Balkans. Its harbor linked it to Constantinople, Asia Minor, Italy, and the wider Mediterranean. Merchants unloaded grain, wine, oil, cloth, ceramics, and imported goods. Soldiers moved through its gates toward the northern frontiers. Bishops presided over churches whose walls gleamed with mosaics and lamps. Athens, though diminished from its classical grandeur, remained a place of education and intellectual memory. Students continued to study rhetoric and philosophy there. The city's pagan schools survived for centuries, preserving traditions of Plato and the old philosophical. academies. But in 529 CE, the Emperor Justinian ordered the closure of the remaining pagan philosophical schools at Athens. The decision symbolized the changing spiritual order of the empire. Classical learning would not disappear, but it would increasingly be preserved, interpreted, and transmitted through Christian institutions. Justinian's reign in the 6th century revealed both the strength and the strain of the Eastern Roman world. From Constantinople, he sought to restore imperial control over territories in the West that had fallen under Germanic kingdoms. His generals reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, briefly extending Roman authority again across the Mediterranean. In Constantinople, Justinian built the great church of Hagia Sophia, whose vast dome seemed to float above the city like a vision of heaven. Its architecture expressed the confidence of an empire that saw itself as both Roman and Christian, universal in aspiration and sacred in purpose. But the costs of war, taxation, disease, and frontier defense were heavy. In 541, a devastating plague swept through the empire. It reached Constantinople and spread along trade routes, carrying death into cities and villages. The population of many regions was reduced. Fields went untilled. Tax revenues declined. Armies became harder to supply. The empire endured, but the balance that had sustained late Roman life became more fragile. Greece, lying between the imperial capital and the Balkan frontier, felt these pressures directly. The northern lands were exposed to raids and migrations from beyond the Danube. In the 6th and 7th centuries, Slavic groups moved into parts of the Balkans, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as settlers, and often in ways difficult to trace precisely through the surviving evidence. The old Roman network of cities and roads weakened in many regions. Some towns shrank behind smaller walls. Others were abandoned or transformed into fortified refuges. The empire faced threats on several fronts at once. In the east, wars with the Persian Empire drained men and resources. Soon afterward, Arab armies, inspired by the new faith of Islam, conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of North Africa. These losses altered the empire profoundly. Its wealthiest provinces were gone. The eastern Mediterranean, once a Roman sea, had become contested. Constantinople remained secure behind its walls and fleets, but the empire became more compact, more defensive, and more dependent upon Anatolia and the Balkans. This smaller empire gradually developed new institutions suited to survival. The old provincial administration was reorganized into military districts, or themes, where soldiers were settled on land and expected to defend their regions. The system was not created all at once, nor did it replace every older structure immediately, but it allowed the empire to maintain local military resources in an age of constant pressure. Greek became still more central to administration and culture. The language of Latin Roman government gave way in practice to the language spoken by most of the empire's eastern population. In the Greek lands, life continued in forms both familiar and altered. Farmers worked small plots in valleys and on hillsides. Shepherds moved flocks through rough pasture. Fishing communities remained tied to the sea. Villages gathered around churches, springs, and fortified sites. In cities, markets persisted, though on a more modest scale than in the old. Roman age. The distinction between town and countryside could blur, especially in insecure times, as people sought protection within walls or near fortified hills. The Orthodox Church became a vital thread of continuity. Bishops, priests, monks, and nuns helped organize local society. Churches marked the passage of life through baptism, marriage, fasting, feast days, and burial. The liturgy, sung in Greek and filled with incense, candles, icons, and solemn procession, gave people a shared sacred language. For a peasant in a remote valley, the empire in Constantinople might seem distant, but the local church was present in the calendar of the year and the most important moments of family life. Monasticism became especially influential. Men and women withdrew from ordinary society for many reasons: devotion, repentance, the desire for solitude, or the hope of living closer to God. Some lived alone in caves or simple cells. Others entered organized communities where prayer, labor, and obedience structured the day. Monasteries cultivated land, copied manuscripts, cared for travelers, and became centers of local economic as well as spiritual life. In Greece, the dramatic landscape lent itself naturally to monastic retreat. Mountain slopes, remote islands, caves, and cliffs became places where human settlement and sacred solitude met. The icon, an image of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or a saint, became central to Orthodox devotion. Icons were not viewed merely as decoration. They were understood as windows toward holy persons and sacred realities, objects before which believers could pray, light lamps, and seek comfort. Yet their importance also led to a major conflict within the empire. In the 8th and 9th centuries, emperors attempted to restrict or destroy icons, believing that their veneration had become a form of idolatry, or that divine displeasure had fallen upon the empire because of them. This controversy, known as iconoclasm, divided households, monasteries, bishops, and emperors. Icons were removed from churches, walls were whitewashed, and monks who defended sacred images sometimes suffered punishment. Others believed the emperor had a duty to purify Christian worship. The dispute was not only theological, it concerned the relationship between imperial authority, popular devotion, and the church. In 843, the restoration of icons was celebrated in Constantinople, an event still remembered in Orthodox tradition as the triumph of orthodoxy. Thereafter, icons resumed their place in Greek religious life, becoming some of the most enduring expressions of Byzantine art and faith. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire had recovered much of its strength. Constantinople remained a city of immense wealth and complexity, its markets stocked with silk, spices, metalwork, manuscripts, and goods from distant lands. Its palaces housed emperors surrounded by court ritual, officials, guards, eunuchs, diplomats, and petitioners. Foreign visitors often found the city overwhelming. Its churches, walls, harbors, and ceremonies seemed designed to display the power of a Christian empire that had survived crises which might have destroyed any lesser state. The Greek provinces benefited from this recovery. Thessaloniki flourished as a commercial and administrative center. Cities and towns in the Peloponnese, central Greece, and the Aegean Islands participated in trade. Agricultural production increased in some regions. New churches were built, often decorated with mosaics or frescoes showing saints, angels, prophets, and scenes from Scripture. The classical past had not vanished, but Byzantine people saw themselves chiefly through the identity of Orthodox Romans. Their empire was Christian. Their emperor ruled by divine favor. Their language was Greek. Their memory joined Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian faith into a single inherited world. The empire's relations with its northern neighbors were equally important. Bulgarians, Serbs, Rus, and other peoples entered the orbit of Byzantine diplomacy, trade, war, and religion. Missionaries and teachers from the empire carried Orthodox Christianity and Greek religious culture into the Slavic world. The conversion of the Bulgarians and later the Ruses of Kiev created a broad Orthodox sphere centered spiritually on Constantinople. Greece was not merely a passive frontier of this world. Its ports, monasteries, bishops, and merchants formed part of the network through which ideas, goods, and sacred traditions travelled. The 11th century brought new changes. In 1054, long-standing tensions between the churches of Rome and Constantinople contributed to a formal breach later known as the Great Schism. The separation was not instantly felt in every village or town, and relations between Eastern and Western Christians remained complicated. But over time, the Orthodox East and the Latin West came to see themselves as distinct religious worlds. For Greece, this distinction would become increasingly significant, especially when Western armies and merchants arrived in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time, the empire faced new military challenges. Turkish peoples entered Anatolia in growing numbers, and after the Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071, much of the empire's Anatolian heartland became vulnerable. The loss was profound. Anatolia had long provided soldiers, taxes, grain, and manpower. As it became increasingly contested, Constantinople turned more often toward Western mercenaries and alliances. This helped create the conditions for the Crusades. The First Crusade began at the end of the 11th century, when Western European knights and pilgrims moved eastward toward Jerusalem. For the Byzantines, these armed foreigners were both potential allies and a source of danger. They could fight against Turkish powers, but they also had their own leaders, ambitions, and religious loyalties. The Greeks, as Western Europeans often called the Byzantine Romans, were viewed with suspicion by many crusaders who found their courtly manners, Greek language, and Orthodox faith unfamiliar. In the Greek lands, the presence of Western merchants and soldiers became more visible. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and other Italian maritime cities sought trading privileges in Byzantine ports. Their ships carried goods across the Mediterranean, and their communities gained influence in Constantinople and elsewhere. The empire received useful commercial connections, but it also granted privileges that weakened its own merchants and increased foreign control over trade. The greatest catastrophe came not from an external Muslim army, but from Western Christian crusaders. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, diverted from its original purpose, captured Constantinople. The city was looted with extraordinary violence. Churches, palaces, libraries, and homes were stripped of treasures. Sacred objects were carried westward. The bronze horses that once stood in the hippodrome were taken to Venice, where they remained as trophies of conquest. For the people of Constantinople, the event was a trauma of almost unimaginable scale. The heart of the Orthodox Roman world had been taken not by longtime enemies, but by fellow Christians from the West. The conquerors established a Latin empire in Constantinople and divided Byzantine territories among themselves. Greek lands were broken into a patchwork of Latin principalities, Venetian possessions, and Greek successor states. In the Peloponnese, Frankish lords formed the Principality of Achaia. In Athens, Western rulers occupied the ancient city and its acropolis. Venetian merchants gained control of strategic islands and ports, including Crete, whose harbours became important stations in their maritime empire. The Greek world, already weakened by earlier losses, became deeply fragmented. Yet Byzantine political life did not end. Greek rulers established successor states in several regions. The Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia became the strongest of these, preserving imperial traditions and working patiently toward the recovery of Constantinople. The Despotate of Epirus controlled parts of western Greece and the Balkans. The Empire of Trebizond endured along the Black Sea coast. Each claimed some share of the Roman inheritance. Each faced both Latin rivals and other Greek competitors. For ordinary people, the aftermath of 1204 meant new taxes, new landlords, altered legal systems, and uncertain loyalties. A Greek farmer in the Peloponnese might now owe obligations to a Frankish lord. A Cretan artisan might live under Venetian rule while worshipping in an Orthodox church. A merchant might need to negotiate between Greek, Italian, and local authorities. Cultural boundaries were real, and conflict could be bitter. Yet daily life also required accommodation. Trade continued. Marriages crossed communities. Languages and customs mingled in port towns and frontier districts. In 1261, the Empire of Nicaea succeeded in recovering Constantinople. The return of the Byzantine emperor was celebrated as a restoration, but the empire that returned was far weaker than the one that had fallen. Its population and resources had been diminished. Italian merchants retained great privileges. Many former territories remained outside imperial control. The restored capital still possessed its incomparable location, its churches, and its imperial memory, but its walls enclosed a city less prosperous than before. The later Byzantine centuries were marked by a mixture of artistic brilliance, religious intensity, political fragmentation, and mounting anxiety. In places such as Mestras, near ancient Sparta in the Peloponnese, Byzantine rulers and nobles created a refined courtly center. Churches were decorated with vivid frescoes. Scholars studied ancient Greek texts. Monasteries preserved religious and literary traditions. The so-called Palaiologan Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, art, and philosophy. Byzantine intellectuals copied and commented upon the works of Plato, Aristotle, historians, poets, and mathematicians. Their efforts would later help carry Greek learning into Renaissance Italy. But intellectual renewal could not solve the empire's military weakness. Serbia and Bulgaria rose in the Balkans. Italian powers dominated sea trade. Civil wars between rival Byzantine factions weakened the state from within. In the 14th century, the empire faced a new and increasingly formidable power, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans began as one among several Turkish dynasties in Anatolia, but under capable rulers, they expanded steadily. Their warriors crossed into Europe and established a foothold in the Balkans. Unlike earlier invaders who might raid and withdraw, the Ottomans built an enduring state. They took cities, settled soldiers and officials, organized taxation, and absorbed local elites into their system. Their armies combined cavalry, infantry, artillery, and disciplined institutions that made them increasingly difficult to resist. For the Greeks and other Orthodox peoples of the Balkans, Ottoman expansion came gradually, then with gathering force. Towns and fortresses fell. Local rulers paid tribute or sought alliances. Some lands changed hands repeatedly. In the Peloponnese, in Thessaly, in Macedonia, and across the islands, people lived with the possibility that the political world they had known might soon disappear. The Byzantine emperors appealed repeatedly to Western Europe for aid, sometimes offering religious concessions in hopes of securing military support. But the divisions between Orthodox and Catholic Christians, along with the competing interests of Western states, made effective unity difficult. By the 15th century, Constantinople was surrounded by Ottoman territory. The empire had been reduced to scattered fragments. The capital itself, parts of the Peloponnese, and a few coastal holdings. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II brought a large army and powerful artillery against the city. Constantinople's walls had resisted sieges for centuries, but gunpowder weapons altered the balance. Massive cannons battered the ancient defences. Ottoman ships were moved overland into the Golden Horn to bypass the chain that blocked the harbour. The siege lasted for weeks. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces broke into Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died in the fighting. With him ended the line of emperors who had ruled the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 1,000 years. The fall of Constantinople was a moment of grief and shock for Orthodox Christians, but it was also the beginning of a new imperial order. Mehmed II made the city his capital. He understood its strategic and symbolic value, and he sought to restore it as a thriving centre of the Ottoman Empire. The conquest of Constantinople did not immediately bring all Greek lands under Ottoman rule. The despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese survived for several years, while islands and coastal territories remained under Venetian or Genoese control. But the direction of history was clear. By the later 15th century, most of mainland Greece had passed under Ottoman authority. Crete remained Venetian until the 17th century. The Ionian Islands, lying west of the mainland, would remain largely outside Ottoman rule under Venetian protection. Yet for the majority of Greek-speaking Orthodox communities, the Ottoman age had begun. The Ottoman Empire governed a diverse population of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and many ethnic and linguistic communities. It did not attempt to make all its subjects identical. Religion, more than nationality in the modern sense, shaped much of the empire's organization. Orthodox Christians belonged to the Rum Millet, the community of Roman or Orthodox believers. The ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople held an important role as spiritual leader and intermediary with the Ottoman state. Greek bishops and local clergy helped administer community affairs, including marriage, inheritance, education, and religious practice. This system did not mean equality. Christians paid special taxes, held an inferior legal status in important respects, and could face arbitrary treatment from local authorities. The burdens varied greatly according to place and period. Some regions suffered heavily from taxation, military campaigns, piracy, or local corruption. Others found ways to prosper within the imperial economy. The Ottoman state was vast, and its rule was never experienced uniformly. A mountain village in Epirus, an island port in the Aegean, and a Greek quarter in Constantinople lived under different conditions. In rural Greece, most people worked the land. They cultivated grain, olives, vines, vegetables, and fruit. They raised sheep and goats in upland pastures. Village life was structured around family, church, seasonal labor, and local custom. Taxes were collected in money, produce, or labor. A good harvest might bring modest security. A failed harvest could bring debt and hunger. The presence of the state might be felt mainly through tax collectors, soldiers passing through, legal disputes, and the demands of local landholders. The mountains offered both hardship and refuge. In remote regions, communities could maintain a measure of autonomy, especially where Ottoman control was thin. Some mountain peoples developed traditions of local self-government and armed defense. The klepts, irregular bandits or guerrilla fighters, became figures of later Greek legend. They could resist Ottoman authority, but they could also prey upon local villagers. Alongside them stood the armatoloi, armed Christians appointed by Ottoman authorities to maintain order in difficult districts. The line between rebel protector, bandit, and official could be uncertain, changing with circumstance and loyalty. Greek maritime communities found opportunities in the empire's trading networks. Islanders from Hydra, Spetses, Sara, Chios, and other places developed shipping traditions that connected the Aegean to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Greek merchants carried grain, timber, wine, oil, textiles, and manufactured goods. Some settled in major Ottoman cities or formed diaspora communities in Venice, Vienna, Odessa, Trieste, and other commercial centers. Wealthy merchants funded churches, schools, libraries, and charitable institutions in their home regions. The Greek Orthodox Church remained a guardian of religious and cultural continuity, though it was not always a political force for rebellion. Clergy often had to cooperate with Ottoman authorities to protect their communities. Monasteries became places of worship, learning, refuge, and economic activity. On Mount Athos, a peninsula in northern Greece, monastic communities from across the Orthodox world maintained a life of prayer and manuscript culture. In the islands and mountains, small monasteries kept lamps burning before icons, while the world beyond their walls changed rulers and languages. Education survived unevenly. There was no universal system of Greek schooling, and many rural people remained unable to read. But in towns and prosperous communities, teachers preserved Greek language, religious texts, and elements of classical learning. Schools were supported by church institutions and merchant benefactors. Greek books were printed abroad, especially in Venice, then carried back into Ottoman lands. The ancient past acquired a new meaning. Homer, Plato, and the memory of classical Greece were not simply relics. They became sources of cultural pride for educated Greeks who lived without a state of their own. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced growing pressures from internal difficulties, European rivals, and the expansion of Russia. Trade patterns changed. The Greek merchant diaspora became wealthier and more connected to Western Europe. Students and intellectuals encountered the ideas of the Enlightenment: natural rights, popular sovereignty, national identity, and the belief that old political orders could be remade. These ideas did not replace Orthodox faith or local tradition, but they gave new language to hopes that had long existed in quieter forms. One of the most important figures of this awakening was Rigas Velestinlis, often known as Rigas Feraios. Born in Thessaly, he travelled through the Balkans and Central Europe, absorbing revolutionary ideas circulating after the French Revolution. He imagined not simply a Greek uprising, but a broader Balkan republic in which peoples oppressed by Ottoman rule might live as equal citizens. His plans were discovered before they could be realized, and he was executed in 1798. Yet his writings and his death gave emotional force to the idea that liberation could be imagined, planned, and pursued. The vision of a modern Greek nation developed gradually. It drew strength from several sources: Orthodox Christianity, the survival of Greek language, local traditions, memories of Byzantium, admiration for ancient Greece, commercial networks, and the political ideas of Europe. These sources did not always fit easily together. Some imagined a restored Christian empire centered on Constantinople. Others imagined a constitutional nation-state modeled on Western Europe. Some looked to the ancient city-states for inspiration, while others found their deepest identity in the church and village. But the conviction grew that the Greeks were more than a religious community within an empire. They were a people with a history and a claim to political life of their own. In 1814, a secret organization called the Philiki Eteria, the Society of Friends, was founded in the Black Sea port of Odessa by Greek merchants and patriots. Its members worked quietly through networks of trust, letters, symbols, and personal connections. They sought support among merchants, clergy, soldiers, local leaders, and the Greek diaspora. The plan for rebellion was uncertain and dangerous. The Ottoman Empire remained powerful, and earlier uprisings had been crushed. But the conditions of the early 19th century seemed to offer a narrow opening. The Napoleonic Wars had unsettled Europe. National movements were stirring in different regions. Russia presented itself as a protector of Orthodox Christians, even though its support could never be assumed. Greek shipowners had gained experience and wealth through Mediterranean trade during years of war. In the Peloponnese, local notables, armed bands, monks, and villagers lived with long memories of conflict and resistance. The possibility of revolt moved from private conversation toward organized action. In 1821, the long Ottoman age in Greece began to break apart. The first attempt at uprising, led by Alexander Ypsilantis, north of the Danube, failed quickly. But the revolt soon spread to the Peloponnese, central Greece, and several islands. In villages and towns, men took up old weapons, hunting guns, knives, and whatever arms they could find. Priests blessed banners. Local leaders called followers to their side. Merchants offered money. Sailors prepared ships. The movement was not yet a unified national army, but it carried a force that could not easily be contained. The struggle ahead would be long, divided, and painful. It would require more than memories of ancient glory or hopes of liberation. It would demand endurance from farmers, sailors, refugees, and families whose lives were about to be drawn into war. Out of the ruins of empire, amid courage, cruelty, sacrifice, and disagreement, a modern Greek state would slowly begin to take shape. As the first fires of rebellion spread across the Greek lands in 1821, they carried with them the weight of many vanished worlds. They carried memories of the ancient cities that had once stood beside the Aegean, of the Roman and Byzantine centuries, of monasteries in mountain silence, and of generations who had kept their faith and language through the long passage of imperial rule.